The first whiff never warned anyone. It drifted through the narrow presses of Fleet Street like a perfume too modern to be trusted, sharp, cold, almost sweet, as if the air itself had been skimmed with frost. Printers felt it first, standing over hot metal and inked rollers, pausing mid-sentence when that strange coolness brushed their lungs. In the basements beneath the newsrooms, where the city's stories were boiled down to truth or scandal, tiny blue-labeled bottles began appearing beside lamps and ledger books, a drop to still the nerves, a breath to quiet the hands, a little miracle to make exhaustion feel like elegance. But London is a city that notices everything it pretends not to. Doctors whispered that ether calmed excess energies. Reporters called it a thinking aid. Young clerks claimed it made each heartbeat feel like a polished clock striking the hour. And all along Fleet Street, men who prided themselves on iron discipline found themselves slipping into alleyways for just one more. Inhale, eyes glassy, laughter too light, steps too careless for men who once feared scandal more than death. Then the danger arrived quietly, like fog settling on a quiet dawn. A compositor collapsed at his frame, hands still stained with type metal. A senior editor, respected for his sobriety, was found trembling behind locked doors, clutching a bottle he swore wasn't his. And in the rooms above the pubs, where the city's most trusted voices drafted tomorrow's headlines, London's brightest minds learned that ether did not simply steady the nerves, it owned them. Fleet Street thought it had mastered the story. Instead, the story was mastering them. Subscribe and stay with me. There are darker truths in these lamplit corridors, where every breath carried a risk no one wished to name. Tell me, where are you listening from tonight? The morning began with the familiar rasp of metal type being set, a rhythm so steady that even the gas lamps seemed to flicker in time with it. Fleet Street was still half asleep, its windows fogged, its gutters glossy with last night's rain, and the presses below ground thrummed like hidden machinery in some industrial underworld. The printers moved with grim precision, ink-stained hands, stiff collars, weary eyes, each man trained to read reversed letters as easily as his own thoughts. They did not expect surprises. Fleet Street did not welcome them. Yet, on this morning, something awaited them on the compositor's main bench. A small blue-labeled bottle, cool to the touch, catching the lamplight with a faint, almost crystalline shimmer. At first, no one spoke. The printers merely exchanged glances in the half-light, uncertain whether the bottle belonged to an editor finishing late or to some careless errand boy. The label was smudged at the edges, the lettering elegant enough to suggest a chemist from one of the better streets. But it was the scent that truly unsettled them. The moment the cork loosened, an icy sweetness drifted over the desk, as if winter had crept into the room on silent feet. It was not unpleasant, but it was unfamiliar, and all unfamiliar things in Fleet Street raised quiet concern. The compositor named Harrow was the first to touch it. He was a man known for steady hands, the sort who could line up 12-point type in the dark without misplacing a single letter. Yet lately, even he had been betrayed by a faint tremor, the result, he claimed, of overwork and sleepless nights. When he lifted the bottle, its weight surprised him. It felt lighter than expected, like it held more air than liquid. He uncorked it fully and inhaled the faint vapor. Just a hint, just enough to breathe without meaning to. A chill, soft and deliberate, moved down his throat. The change was subtle, almost gentle. Harrow blinked, exhaled, and felt an impossible clarity fan out through his chest. The tremor eased, his vision sharpened. Even the clutter of letters before him seemed to fall into perfect, almost effortless order. His fellow printers saw it instantly, not because he swayed or spoke, but because he grew still, too still, with a quiet that did not belong to a man awake at dawn. "What is it?" one of them asked, though his voice barely rose above the presses below. Harrow set the bottle down carefully. "Something for the nerves," he murmured, though he had no way of knowing whether that was true. He only knew it made the morning air taste cleaner, The endless columns of type looked suddenly agreeable. The fatigue behind his eyes loosen and drift away like a forgotten dream. They watched him work. His movements were flawless, smooth, confident, almost delicate. When he reached for the bottle again an hour later, no one remarked upon it. Fleet Street rewarded efficiency. After all, if a man found a way to keep his hands steady, even by unusual means, surely it was no business of theirs. Yet the scent of ether lingered in the press room long after the cork was replaced, settling into the wooden drawers, curling around the metal type, clinging to sleeves, hair, breath. The men pretended not to notice how cold the air felt, how sweet the ink smelled that morning, how quietly the tremors faded. Harrow's hands were steady. The bottle remained on the desk, and Fleet Street, without knowing it, had taken its first breath. The presses did not simply mark the hours they consumed them. By midday, the underground rooms of Fleet Street felt less like workplaces and more like mechanical caverns, where time existed only as the space between editions. The compositors bent over their trays, shoulders stiff, eyes narrowed, their fingers moving in practice sweeps across the tiny iron letters. Each man carried his own small burden: sleeplessness, strain, the cold that seeped endlessly from the stone floors. But none carried it more quietly than young Percival Finch. Percival was scarcely 20, thin as wire, with a face that still seemed surprised by adulthood. He had joined the presses with the usual ambitions: steady wages, a modest respectability, perhaps even a room of his own one day beyond the boarding house walls. But he possessed one flaw fatal to his trade, a faint but persistent tremor that arrived whenever he grew overly tired or anxious. And in Fleet Street, tiredness and anxiety were the eternal companions of every dawn. Harrow noticed it first. He had become something of a curiosity since the bottle appeared, his hands calm, his pace brisk, his focus unnervingly clear. Others had chalked it up to renewed discipline, perhaps even divine mercy, but Percival watched him with a peculiar fascination. It was as if Harrow had found a private method to command the nerves, something beyond mere willpower. The proof came that afternoon. Percival fumbled a line of type, just a slight slip, but enough to spill an entire pocketful of letters across the bench. The sound was loud, metallic, humiliating. A few men glanced up. One sighed. Another muttered. Percival reddened and crouched to collect the scattered pieces, knowing the error meant lost time and slowed printing. Harrow approached quietly. "Hold a moment," he said, not unkindly. Percival stood, palms sweating, expecting correction. Instead, Harrow reached beneath the desk, withdrew the small blue bottle, and held it between two fingers as though offering a quill or a coin. "It helps," Harrow said simply. The words were spoken in confidence, man to man, trade to trade. Percival hesitated not because he feared vice, but because the gesture felt forbidden. The room seemed to dim around them, presses humming like distant tides. Harrow removed the cork and let the faint, icy sweetness drift into the air. "Just breathe," he murmured. Percival leaned closer. A whisper of coldness slipped into his lungs, light as frost on a window pane. The effect startled him, not a rush, not a haze, but a kind of delicate untying. His heartbeat steadied, his fingers grew obedient. The trembling that had plagued him since boyhood quieted, as though soothed by an unseen hand. Harrow nodded. "Now try again." Percival lifted a new line of type. His hands moved smoothly, as if the letters themselves wished to be arranged. The men nearest him noticed, glancing toward Harrow with something between curiosity and envy. No one spoke of the bottle directly, but its presence became an unspoken fixture of the bench, slipped into a pocket during long hours, passed discreetly between weary hands, returned without a word. A breath before lunch, a breath after, sometimes two during the final rush to meet the evening edition. Gradually, imperceptibly, the tremors vanished from the room. Fingers that once shook now danced. Mistakes faded. The air grew colder, sweeter, sharper, The printers worked with a precision so crisp it seemed almost unnatural. By week's end, the bottle was no longer a novelty. It had become a companion, silent, reliable, necessary. And though Percival never dared ask where it came from, he found himself reaching for it more readily each day, as if some clock within him had begun to tick in harmony with the vapor. Fleet Street, always hungry for efficiency, welcomed the change. But the bottle waited on its shelf, patient and bright, knowing that steady hands were merely the beginning. The editors of Fleet Street prided themselves on a certain cultivated severity. Their rooms were sanctuaries of order amid the chaos of the presses, lamps trimmed neatly, ledgers stacked like battlements, the air thick not with ink, but with respectability. Here, sentences were weighed like sovereign coins, headlines sharpened as though for battle, and the great machinery of public opinion turned with relentless precision. These were not men who tolerated disorder, certainly not indulgence, never weakness. And yet, by the second week after the bottle's quiet arrival downstairs, a strange new rhythm had settled upon the upper floor. It began with editor Bracknell, a man known for iron self-discipline and an almost priestly self-denial. His colleagues joked that he drank only tea, worked from dawn to dusk, and had never been seen to blink during an argument. But Bracknell had grown older in recent years, the hour before publication now marked by a faint weariness at the corners of his eyes. His hands, once steady enough to correct proofs without so much as touching the page, had begun to betray him. One morning, just as the final revisions were being gathered, Bracknell paused mid-sentence. His pen hovered above the paper. A tremor, small but visible, rippled across his fingers. He pressed the hand to his chest as though to quiet it, but the tremor persisted, pulsing with each heartbeat. The sub-editors noticed, exchanging anxious glances. A faltering editor threatened the entire day's order. Bracknell noticed their concern and straightened his shoulders with stiff dignity, but the effort cost him. When he rose from his chair, he gripped the desk for support. "Mr. Harrow sent something up," murmured a junior clerk from the doorway, holding a folded cloth in which something clinked softly. "Said it might be of use." Bracknell frowned, suspicion sharpening his features. But the tremor returned, and with it, a flash of humiliation. The clerk set the cloth on the desk and departed quickly, unwilling to witness more. Bracknell unwrapped it. A single blue-labeled bottle gleamed in the lamplight, the same cold shimmer Harrow had felt days earlier. The editor stared at it for a long moment, half offended, half intrigued. He lifted the cork just enough for a tendril of icy sweetness to rise. The scent brushed his mind like a gloved hand. His breath thawed into something calmer. He closed his eyes and inhaled. The clarity that followed was astonishing, like stepping from a fog-choked alley into crisp winter air. His thoughts aligned in perfect columns. The article before him, once a muddle of revisions, now unfurled itself into a masterful structure. Even the ticking of the office clock seemed to fall into agreeable rhythm. When he resumed writing, his pen glided as though guided by invisible rails. The sub-editors watched through the glass-paneled door. His transformation was impossible to ignore. Within days, 2 more editors discreetly requested the clarifying agent. By week's end, nearly all of them had adopted the ritual. A quiet breath before tackling the morning proofs, a second before shaping the leading editorial, a third on especially difficult afternoons when London's scandals grew thick as fog. Conversations changed. Voices softened. Arguments that once roared across the room dissolved into gentle, contemplative murmurs. Ether granted a sense of mastery of sharpened wit, refined judgment, even moral certainty. "It steadies the mind," Bracknell insisted, brushing off an inquiry from a concerned colleague. "We are merely keeping pace with the age." But Fleet Street was not keeping pace. It was slipping quietly, elegantly, into dependency. By the time the first empty bottle rolled unnoticed beneath Bracknell's desk, The editors had already begun whispering among themselves. Just a breath, only enough to think clearly. Not a vice, a tool, a gentleman's aid in a demanding trade. And so the vapor crept upward through Fleet Street, from basement to editorial sanctum, softening minds that once prided themselves on unshakable resolve. The presses below thundered on, unaware that the men who guided them had begun to lose something precious. Not their skill, not yet, but their certainty that their thoughts were entirely their own. The night shift always carried a particular heaviness, as if the building itself grew tired of holding so many stories at once. Gas lamps hissed along the walls, each one floating in its own small halo of pale flame, casting long, uncertain shadows across the pressroom floor. The air was thick with ink, dense, metallic, almost warm, and the steady thrum of the machinery rose and fell like the breathing of some vast mechanical beast. Men moved through the room with practiced haste, their faces streaked with soot and fatigue, their collars damp with the sweat of long hours. Harrow's bottle had already made its quiet rounds that evening. A breath here, a breath there, slipped between tasks like a secret handshake. The compositors worked with an eerie precision, their hands gliding across trays of type with unusual grace. Even Percival, usually nervous at the start of a long night, felt a bright alertness settling behind his eyes, a clarity that bordered on exhilaration. No one spoke of the vapor that offered them such comfort. They did not need to. The scent, cold, sweet, unmistakable, hung lightly in the room, threading itself between the clatter of type and the turning of gears. It was near 2 a.m. when the change in atmosphere began. A subtle shift, so delicate that at first the men took it for nothing more than exhaustion. One of the newer compositors, a man called Millsworth, had been working steadily at the corner table, assembling the final lines for the morning edition. He was competent, quiet, and young, eager to impress, always the first to volunteer for the hardest shifts. But tonight, something was off. His motions slowed, his breath grew shallow. Twice he drew back from the type case, blinking as though the letters swam before him. Harrow noticed first. "Millsworth?" he called softly. The young man looked up, or tried to. His eyes widened, unfocused, reflective like glass catching distant lamplight. He opened his mouth as if to speak, but only a whisper escaped, thin and brittle. Then his knees buckled. The sound of his collapse cut through the room like a dropped blade. Metal type scattered. The presses stuttered for half a cycle, before roaring on again, indifferent to human frailty. Percival rushed forward, Harrow close behind, and together they eased Millsworth onto the wooden floor. His skin felt unnaturally cold, as if the frost outside had slipped beneath his coat to settle against his bones. His breath came in shallow gasps, each one tinged with that unmistakable scent ether, sharp as winter, sweet as poison. "Fetch someone," Harrow ordered, though his voice carried a tremor of its own. But no one moved at first. A strange guilt pinned them to the floor, mingled with fear. Every man in that press room knew the truth, though none dared say it aloud. Millsworth had used the bottle. Perhaps more than once. Perhaps too eagerly. Perhaps the vapor that steadied their hands had been too generous with its comfort. Percival knelt beside the fallen compositor, feeling for a pulse that fluttered weakly beneath his fingertips. Millsworth's eyes drifted open, unfocused, then closed again as his breath hitched in a sound that was neither sigh nor gasp, a fragile, drowning thing. Finally, the foreman arrived, summoned by Harrow's shout. He took one look at the bottle still peeking from Millsworth's coat pocket and stiffened, bitterness rising behind his calm exterior. "Clear the room," he muttered, "and get him upstairs. Quietly, quietly, always quietly. No mention in the logs, no note in the morning report, no alarm raised to the editors who depended on timely columns and steady labor. Accidents happened, the foreman would say. Exhaustion, overwork, the night air, anything but the truth. Millsworth survived barely, but he did not return the next evening. His bench remained empty, a silent gap in the neatly ordered world of letters and ink. No one asked where he had gone, but the men noticed something else. The bottle was no longer shared quite so openly. Not because they feared it, but because they feared being caught needing it. And yet, as the lamps burned low and the presses thundered on, one truth settled heavily over Fleet Street. If ether could bring a man to the floor, it could just as easily carry him through a difficult night. And for many, that was enough reason to keep breathing it in. The chemist's shop on Fetter Lane was not remarkable in appearance. A small brass bell above the door chimed softly whenever someone entered, though most of its customers preferred to slip in unnoticed, heads bowed beneath the brim of a hat or the shadow of an umbrella. The windows were fogged with winter breath and covered in neat lettering, advertising tonics for cough, powders for rheumatism, and cordial remedies for fatigue of the nerves. But the real business of the shop, a business that rarely appeared in ink, was conducted at the back counter, where the air always smelled faintly of something cold and metallic. Mr. Winslow, the chemist, carried himself with the gentle air of a man who had learned long ago that curiosity was a luxury best avoided. He recorded names only if a customer insisted. He asked questions only when the law demanded it, and he provided ether clean, clear, and for professional use to anyone who requested it with a steady voice and the correct coin. He had begun selling it to medical men years earlier. Surgeons purchased it for operations, dental practitioners for troublesome molars, a few daring physicians for experimental sleep. But lately, the demand had grown heavier and stranger. Clerk after clerk, printer after printer, young men from Fleet Street with ink-stained cuffs and tired eyes had begun to visit the shop with irregular frequency. At first, Winslow thought little of it. Hard work required strong remedies. But the pattern soon became unmistakable. These men purchased ether, not by the ounce, but by the bottle. Some bought 2, a few bought 3, and none wished for their visits to be remembered. On a particularly cold morning, Harrow himself entered the shop, though Winslow recognized him only by the faint smudge of ink across his right wrist. Harrow's expression was composed, almost serene, but his breath carried the unmistakable coolness of recent inhalation. "A refill," Harrow murmured, setting the empty bottle on the counter. Winslow picked it up. The glass felt warm from being held too warm. He glanced at Harrow, whose eyes flickered with the briefest hint of impatience. The chemist hesitated, but only for a moment. Then he nodded and disappeared into the back room. While Harrow waited, 2 more men entered, one young, one older. Both cast uneasy glances toward the bottle on the counter. The younger man tugged at his collar nervously, his movements jittery and unpredictable. The older man placed a hand on his shoulder, steadying him. "Same as before," the elder whispered to Winslow when he returned. "Please." Winslow hesitated again, this time longer. The younger man's pupils were too wide, his skin too pale. The smell of ether, sweet, icy, unmistakable, clung to him like perfume. Winslow cleared his throat. "You are using it sparingly, I hope?" The older man stiffened. "For work. It sharpens the mind, prevents fatigue. To excess, it may dull the body," Winslow said quietly. The younger man let out a soft, humorless laugh. Then, "Perhaps it may dull the fear as well." A pause settled over the room. Long, fragile, brittle. Winslow handed over the bottles because he always did, and the men departed, their coats brushing against the shelves with hurried, nervous energy. Harrow accepted his refill without a word, but as he slipped the bottle into his coat, he met Winslow's gaze with a look so calm, so disturbingly self-assured, that the chemist felt a twinge of unease. "You must be cautious," Winslow murmured, breaking the silence. Harrow smiled faintly. "We are cautious, Mr. Winslow. That is why we use it. The bell chimed as he left. The shop fell quiet again, save for the faint hiss of the gas lamp and the lingering sweetness in the air. Winslow moved to open the window, letting in a draught of frigid London fog. But even the winter wind could not entirely chase away the chemical fragrance that clung to the room. He had sold remedies all his life to soothe pain, to ease breath, to calm troubled hearts. But this new desire, this new hunger drifting through Fleet Street was something else entirely. Not relief, not comfort, a need. And as the chemist stood alone amidst bottles of harmless tonics and innocent powders, he wondered, for the first time, whether the city had begun to inhale something it would not easily give up. Something sweet, something cold, something dangerous. The physicians of Victorian London were men accustomed to certainty, or at least the appearance of it. Their consulting rooms were lined with leather-bound books, heavy curtains, and polished instruments that gleamed reassuringly beneath the gaslight. Patients expected poise, wisdom, and the quiet assurance that ailments, no matter how troubling, could be soothed with the correct tonic or tincture. And among the many solutions offered for the city's rising tide of exhaustion, anxiety, and nervous complaints, ether soon became the most fashionable prescription of all. It began innocently enough: a droplet on a cloth, a breath before sleep, a small restorative for overworked clerks, delicate women, and harried professionals. Doctors praised its gentle, calming effects and its capacity to stabilize the mind, phrases that sounded authoritative enough to pacify even the most anxious patient. But what the medical journals omitted, what many physicians themselves had not yet realized, was that the relief came tied to an invisible chain. Dr. Theodore Mansfield was among the first to sense it. He was a sober man, prematurely grey, with thin spectacles perched permanently at the edge of his nose. His practice near Chancery Lane attracted a steady stream of professionals, lawyers, bankers, newspaper men whose complaints all shared a common refrain: "I cannot sleep. My hands shake. My thoughts race. The work will not let me rest." Initially, Mansfield prescribed ether sparingly. A small bottle, tightly corked, accompanied by stern instructions, a single breath, diluted, no more than once per night. But his patients returned sooner than expected. They praised the remedy in the same glowing language that had begun spreading through Fleet Street. "It clears the thoughts beautifully, doctor. It steadies my hands. I've never worked so efficiently. May I have another bottle?" Mansfield hesitated every time, yet he continued to provide it because the laws allowed it, because the journals encouraged it, and because the city rewarded any physician who kept its workers functional. But soon the pattern grew impossible to ignore. One early winter morning, Percival Finch, the same pale young compositor from Fleet Street, arrived at Mansfield's surgery with trembling worse than any he had attempted to hide at the presses. He sat rigidly in the examination chair, eyes tired, breath shallow. Mansfield examined him quietly, gently, methodically. "How long have you been using ether?" Mansfield asked. Percival gave a brittle laugh. "Only when needed." "And how often is that?" The young man hesitated, then whispered, "Constantly." His hands shook, even as he tried to still them against his knees. Mansfield touched his wrist, cold as though blood struggled to reach it. "This remedy of yours," Percival murmured, "it cures the nerves, but when it fades, they return twice as fierce. It feels as if my own heartbeat is mocking me." Mansfield removed his spectacles and sighed. He had heard variations of this confession from half a dozen men already, but never spoken so plainly. Ether soothed the mind only to leave it craving the same quiet again, and more urgently each time. In the following weeks, Mansfield noticed the same signs in others: dilated pupils, pale lips, irregular breathing, a peculiar coldness to the skin. patients praised the effects even as they deteriorated before his eyes. A barrister, who once prided himself on eloquence, now stammered without his morning inhalation. A factory overseer swore ether made him a man of steel, but collapsed in Mansfield's waiting room. A schoolteacher confessed that without the vapor she could not bear the sound of her own thoughts. It was as though London itself had grown addicted to clarity. By the time Mansfield attempted to warn his colleagues, many of them were already using ether themselves quietly, privately, under the guise of long hours and heavy responsibilities. They dismissed his concerns with polite laughter. "Surely you exaggerate. It is only a modern aid. All medicines have their dangers." Mansfield grew silent, more troubled with each passing week. He had spent his life trying to calm the nerves of a city that never slept, but now he realized the city's newest cure was making its nights longer, its fears sharper, its people colder. Ether had promised to quiet the tremors. Instead, it had birthed a new kind, a trembling that began in the nerves and grew outward, a trembling that demanded more breath, more bottles, more surrender. And Fleet Street, brilliant, restless, relentless, was already inhaling deeply. Fleet Street never truly slept. Even in the late winter hours, when London's fog clung thick and low to the cobblestones, the presses below ground roared with mechanical hunger. Every edition demanded itself into existence, column by column, line by line, letter by trembling letter. The compositors worked in close quarters, their sleeves rolled high, lamps burning dimly over their stations. Ordinarily, their movements were disciplined, harmonious, almost musical. But not on the night the presses ran crooked. It was shortly after midnight when the first error appeared. A single column printed with an odd slant, tilted just enough to be noticeable, but not enough to halt production. The foreman frowned, inspected the sheet, muttered something about worn bearings, and returned to his rounds. Machines faltered often enough. He did not yet suspect the true cause. By 1 o'clock, the slant had worsened. A second sheet rolled out, carrying a headline compressed unnaturally at the center, the letters pressed so hard that they bruised the paper. Another bore a faint shadowing, as if the type had doubled itself, a ghostly echo lurking behind every letter. The compositors exchanged uneasy glances. The machinery thudded on, oblivious. Harrow felt it first. A faint disorientation, subtle but unmistakable, as though the floor itself tilted beneath his boots. He blinked rapidly, willing the sensation away, telling himself it was only the hour, the cold, the strain of long shifts. But the bottle in his coat pocket felt like a small weight tugging at him, familiar, comforting, undeniable. He resisted at first. The accident with Millsworth still lingered too vividly in his mind. But as he reached for a fresh tray of type, his fingers hesitated. A tremor, slight but growing, passed through them. The clarity he had come to rely upon had begun to dull at the edges, like a knife losing its shine. Around him the others faltered too. Percival dropped a line of type, scattering letters like metallic hail across the bench. Another compositor misaligned an entire paragraph, the right margin drifting drunkenly inward. A third man stood motionless at his station, staring at his work with distant, unfocused eyes. "Steady yourselves," the foreman barked, though his own voice carried an unfamiliar wavering. "We have deadlines." Deadlines, Fleet Street's unforgiving master. Harrow's gaze drifted toward the far wall, where shadows flickered unnaturally with each pulse of the gas lamps. He tried to shake his head clear, but the room seemed to pulse in time with the machinery. The sweet, cold scent of ether hung subtly in the air, so faint that it might have gone unnoticed by anyone unacquainted with it. But Harrow noticed. They all noticed. One by one, hands slipped into pockets. One by one, bottles emerged, small, blue-labeled, identical. A single breath, they told themselves. Just one to steady the nerves, to sharpen the senses, to correct the errors that multiplied with each passing moment. But tonight, Ether's whisper felt different. Instead of clarity, a sharpness tinged with unease spread through their limbs. Their hearts beat faster. Their thoughts flickered. The work before them sharpened into impossible detail, too crisp, too vivid, as though each letter pressed itself into their vision with painful insistence. Percival inhaled too deeply and staggered, catching himself against the edge of the table. Another man slumped onto a stool, blinking hard, trying to focus on lines that refused to remain still. The foreman leaned heavily on a column, his breath shallow, his complexion pallid. And the press's hungry, relentless ran on, their iron jaws chewing through paper and ink with merciless force. Sheets spilled out at crooked angles now. Headlines warped, spacing fractured, punctuation scattered like debris. A front-page illustration printed as though melting. Columns bent like wilted reeds. The foreman finally slammed the emergency lever, halting the machinery with a grinding protest. The sudden silence was deafening. Men stood gasping, sweating despite the cold, their faces pale with a terrible recognition. It was not the machines that had malfunctioned. It was them. Ether had steadied their hands until it unsteadied their minds. It had sharpened their focus until it blurred the world around them. In the oppressive quiet, Harrow looked down at the bottle in his palm. It seemed to glow faintly in the lamplight, inviting, promising, but its promise now rang hollow. Percival whispered, voice trembling, "What? What have we done?" No one answered. The presses stood silent, their crooked pages scattered across the floor like the broken truth of a night when Fleet Street inhaled too deeply and paid the price. Above them, the city slept, unaware. But below ground, the men understood something with chilling clarity. They had crossed a threshold, and Fleet Street would not easily find its way back. By late winter, ether had seeped into the veins of London society with a stealth that would have impressed even the most cunning gossip columnist. It drifted not through the slums or the alehouses, but through drawing rooms, offices, and private clubs, the quiet sanctuaries where respectable men retreated to escape the city's clamor. Here, conversations were measured, boots were polished, and vices were meant to be discreet. And yet ether, with its cold sweetness and deceptive gentleness, found its way inside as if slipping beneath a locked door. The Gentlemen's Club on Boswell Row was the first to feel its presence, a refuge of polished mahogany, carved banisters, and the faint smell of tobacco. It held members who prided themselves on discipline. These were barristers, bankers, senior clerks, the men who supposedly kept London's machinery running smoothly. They met at dawn for coffee, at midday for business, at dusk for brandy. But a few members began arriving earlier than usual. Eyes bright, cheeks pale, hands curiously steady for the hour. It was Mr. Corbin who drew the first whisper. A barrister of impeccable reputation, he was known for his calm temperament and sharp reasoning. But suddenly he grew sharper, still too sharp, some remarked. His speeches in court became unnervingly precise, his arguments cut with a kind of glittering ruthlessness that startled even his clients. Rumor had it he no longer needed sleep, that his hands no longer shook when he wrote late into the night, that he had found something to lift the fog of overwork. When Corbin reached into his coat one afternoon and produced a slender blue bottle, the club steward raised a brow but said nothing. Corbin set the bottle beside his legal papers, uncorked it with a practiced twist, and inhaled softly. He resumed writing with perfect composure, as though nothing in the act were strange, let alone dangerous. By week's end, 2 more members had acquired similar bottles. By month's end, a quiet ritual had taken hold, men stepping into the coat-room under the guise of finding gloves, only to emerge calmer, steadier, strangely invigorated. Ether spread among them like a fashionable rumor passed from colleague to colleague, from club to office, from office to home. It was spoken of only in fragments. A breath helps me finish the ledgers. It calms the mind beautifully. I felt 20 years younger after a single draft. Respectability, after all, did not forbid small indulgences. It merely disguised them. Soon, in boardrooms across the city, men would pause before difficult decisions, their fingers grazing pocketed bottles with unconscious affection. At law offices, clerks swore their efficiency had doubled. At architectural firms, draftsmen whispered that ether steadied the ruler and sharpened the eye. Even in government offices, where decorum reigned with iron authority, a faint sweetness sometimes drifted through the corridors between late-night sessions. But the most telling change was not the scent, it was the silence. Respectable men, who once boasted openly of their cigars, brandy, and late-night triumphs, now withheld certain details. They offered vague explanations for their new composure. They brushed off inquiries with a smile that never reached the eyes. They hid bottles in desk drawers and waistcoat pockets, convinced no one noticed when in truth everyone did. And like all secrets shared by too many, the facade began to crack. Corbin, once so self-assured, now shook faintly if he went too long without a breath. His brilliance blossomed into brilliance's darker twin agitation. He snapped at junior clerks. He paced the club's reading room with restless urgency. His speeches, though dazzling, carried an edge of desperation. One evening, he knocked over a lamp during a particularly heated debate, shattering it against the hearth. The room fell into stunned silence. Corbin apologized profusely, but his hand hovered near his coat pocket, seeking reassurance from the hidden bottle. At that moment, the truth settled over the club's members like a chill. They were not merely indulging in a fashionable modern aid. They were depending on it. And if respectable men who shaped London's commerce, law, and governance were surrendering their steadiness to a bottle no larger than a child's toy, what hope had the rest of the city? Fleet Street inhaled it first, but now London's pillars were breathing with them. Quietly, elegantly, and with a growing, terrible need. Behind the grand facades of Fleet Street, behind the gold-lettered windows, the brass door handles, the neat rows of gas lamps, there lay an alley so narrow that two men could barely pass each other without brushing shoulders. It was a place the public never saw, though it served as a kind of hidden lung for the newspaper offices, a shortcut for errand boys, a smoking refuge for printers, a cooling space for the overheated compositors escaping the furnace-like press rooms. Barrels lined its walls, stacked crates hid spare supplies, and the ground was always slick with a film of rainwater, ink residue, and soot. It was here, in this cramped and nameless passage, that ether began to reveal its true nature. The alley had always been filled with whispers, jokes, complaints, stories carried on clouds of tobacco smoke, but by early spring, a new kind of whisper took root. Not loud, not brazen, but sharp and intimate. Men slipped into the alley with purposeful strides and returned looking lighter, clearer, unnervingly calm. The first time Percival Finch followed someone out, it was only to escape the suffocating warmth of the presses. But what he saw changed everything. It was Harrow steady, stoic Harrow, standing near the crates with his back turned, one hand braced against the brick wall as though steadying himself. In the other hand, he held the familiar blue bottle, its glass blinking faintly like a watchful eye. Harrow tilted his head back, inhaled deeply, then exhaled with a long, slow tremor that looked almost like relief or surrender. Percival hesitated at the corner, unsure whether to reveal his presence, but Harrow heard him anyway. "You may as well come out," Harrow said quietly, not turning around. Percival stepped forward, guilt prickling in his chest. "Everyone uses it," Harrow murmured, his voice soft, almost resigned. "You needn't pretend surprise." Percival glanced at the bottle. "I didn't come for that." "No one comes for it." Harrow wiped the rim of the bottle with a handkerchief. "But we all end up reaching for it." The words lingered like frost. By the week's end, the alley had become a revolving door of furtive visits. Compositors slipped out with their collars raised. Junior reporters pretended to be running errands. only to spend long moments lingering in the shadows. Even one of the subeditors, Mr. Alderton, a man so prim he once scolded a printer for ink-splattered sleeves, began emerging from the alley with an unnatural brightness in his eyes. No one confronted one another. No one needed to. The silence between them was mutual, weighted, complicit. The alley itself began to change. The scent of ether clung to the bricks long after the men returned inside. The cold sweetness mingled with the damp of the London fog, creating a strange, almost sickly perfume. Even the stray cats avoided the place, pacing warily before darting away. One evening, Percival found a half-full bottle lying near the barrels, its label smeared, its cork missing. He picked it up gingerly, as though touching something fragile and alive. A few feet away, muddy footprints led in a staggering line toward the street. Someone had dropped it mid-collapse, he realized. Someone whose hands had grown too unsteady even to cling to their remedy. Rumor spread the next day of a compositor found slumped in the stairwell, breathing shallowly, eyes rolled skyward. The foreman blamed exhaustion, cold drafts, poor diet. But Percival recognized the look. He had seen it in Millsworth. He had seen it in Harrow's worst moments. He had felt the edge of it himself. The alley was no longer a refuge. It had become a threshold, a place where men crossed from discipline to dependence quietly, swiftly, without noticing when their steps had changed. And though the alleys of London had seen many secrets, this one carried a danger unlike the others. For it was not crime or poverty or passion that lingered here, but something colder, sweeter, and far more seductive. A breath that steadied the hands, a breath that quieted the mind, a breath that bound its taker with invisible thread. Fleet Street worked above it, unaware or unwilling to admit that the alley was becoming its true pulse. And with every blue bottle raised beneath the lamplight, the pulse grew faster, more desperate, more demanding. London had always excelled at ignoring what it did not wish to confront. It overlooked poverty by calling it misfortune, overlooked crime by calling it inevitability, and overlooked its own excesses by calling them fashion. In drawing rooms, in taverns, in offices tucked discreetly behind shop fronts, the city carried its secrets like bruises beneath a silk glove. But never had London hidden something as skillfully or as willingly as it hid its growing appetite for ether. By early spring, the signs were unmistakable to those who had reason to look. A gentleman at a coffee-house with pupils just a touch too wide, a typist in a law office whose fingers moved with uncanny speed, then abruptly faltered as if betraying her, a young schoolmaster lecturing with breath that smelled faintly of ice and sweetness, a shop girl who swayed from sudden faintness, yet insisted she was only light-headed from the hour, and always the subtle instinct to look away. People whispered, of course. They always did, but their whispers stopped well short of truth. It must be the air. Overwork, surely. These are fast times, we must keep pace somehow. London prided itself on industry, on progress, on being the beating heart of the modern world. Ether, then, was merely a modern necessity. At least, that was the comfort people offered one another, wrapped in the softness of polite denial. Even the police, who ought to have noticed more than most, remained peculiarly silent. Constables passing Fleet Street could detect the scent drifting faintly from basement grates, a cold sweetness that made them pause before continuing their rounds. A sergeant remarked privately that the printer's alley smelled unnaturally clean, like winter perfume. But no patrol was dispatched, no inquiry opened. Ether was legal, after all, respectable, a medical convenience. What harm could be tied to a substance sold by any reputable chemist? The city moved on. Newspapers continued their nightly races to the press, even when an entire batch printed crooked. Offices still hummed with activity long after the lamps were lit, even when clerks began arriving earlier each morning with pale faces and unusually steady hands. The church bells rang, the horse-drawn omnibuses rattled along the streets, and the Thames carried its cold breath through the city as it had for centuries. London did not stop. London did not question. London simply breathed deeper and deeper. Yet, for every polite nod toward overwork, there were private fears tucked behind closed doors. Families noticed changes in their loved ones but hesitated to name them. Wives remarked that their husbands seemed distant, their tempers sharper, their sleep restless. Mothers found small corks in waistcoat pockets and pretended they belonged to harmless medicines. Boarding house keepers heard gasps through thin walls, ragged inhalations followed by eerie stillness. And the city's physicians, who should have recognized the pattern immediately, chose the path of least disruption. They noted symptoms they could not credibly diagnose: nervous strain, incipient hysteria, exhaustion of the constitution, and prescribed rest that no one had time to take. Only Dr. Mansfield looked more closely. He alone marked the tremors, the erratic pulses, the strange combination of clarity and collapse. But his warnings, spoken softly among colleagues, dissolved without consequence. The others merely shook their heads. Too much imagination, Mansfield. Ether is a miracle of the age. You worry too greatly. It was easier not to worry, and so London pretended not to notice. It ignored the sweet chill in the air. It ignored the trembling behind steady hands. It ignored the bottles slipping into pockets, drawers, and private desks. For denial was effortless where truth was inconvenient. And if Fleet Street, the city's mouthpiece, its mirror, its relentless chronicler, had quietly fallen under Ether's spell, then who in London would dare to reveal it? The city moved forward, polishing its veneer of control, unaware that beneath the surface something delicate and dangerous had begun to spread. A silence, a sweetness, a dependency that grew deeper with every unspoken breath. London inhaled. London exhaled. And London pretended nothing at all had changed. Dr. Ambrose Lewin considered himself a practical man, measured in speech, restrained in judgment, and quietly proud of his reputation for calm reason. His surgery on Dorset Street welcomed a steady stream of Londoners whose ailments he could diagnose with comfortable confidence: indigestion from rushed meals, headaches from poor ventilation, nerves frayed by overwork. These were the ordinary afflictions of a city moving faster than its people could bear. His remedies, drawn from decades of study and a shelf of well-thumbed medical volumes, were equally ordinary. But gradually, almost imperceptibly, the ordinary remedies lost their edge. Patients arrived with trembling hands, shallow breaths, and minds that could not be soothed by sleep or tea or the usual sedatives. Their suffering carried a new quality, something taut and restless beneath the skin, a deeper fatigue, a quieter desperation. And yet they all sought the same thing: relief, swift and uncomplicated. Dr. Lewin first encountered ether as a medical marvel, praised in journals for its ability to quiet pain and dull panic. Surgeons lauded it, dentists embraced it, and though Lewin preferred to use it sparingly, he found himself turning to it with increasing frequency. A single inhalation could calm even the most overwrought patient. A second breath would usually settle the nerves entirely. A third, though rarely administered, could lift a patient out of trembling despair. He administered it with care, a cloth folded twice, a drop or two from a carefully sealed bottle. Patients always gasped softly at the first touch of cold sweetness. Their eyes softened, their muscles loosened, their breathing slowed into something serene, and they always thanked him. "It is miraculous, doctor. I feel myself again. Could I have a small bottle, just in case?" He refused, at first. Ether belonged in surgeries, not drawing rooms, but as the weeks lengthened into months, the pressure to provide it increased. Businessmen with worn faces spoke of sleepless nights and frantic deadlines. School teachers confessed they could not maintain order in their classrooms without trembling. A widowed mother of 4 came nearly in tears, saying her nerves were unraveling thread by thread. Dr. Lewin was not a cruel man. He did not enjoy watching suffering, so he began to write small notes, technically prescriptions, though the chemists rarely required them. For the nerves, he would explain, to be used sparingly. He trusted his patients to follow his guidance. After all, they were respectable men and women, not the sort prone to excess. But soon, patterns emerged he could no longer ignore. One solicitor returned for a refill scarcely days after his first bottle, his hands already starting to tremble again. A usually composed governess appeared at Lewin's door at dawn, eyes glassy, asking urgently if he had just a bit more. Even a clergyman who took ether only after claiming it helped him prepare sermons began to look pale and drawn, with coldness clinging to his breath. Dr. Lewin told himself these were isolated cases. London exhausted everyone. Ether merely provided a buffer while society adjusted to its own relentless pace. Yet each evening, as he locked his surgery, he felt unease circling at the edges of his mind like a wolf stepping softly between shadows. Then came the case of Mr. Danehill. A senior clerk, steady and conscientious, Mr. Danehill had returned for his 3rd prescription in less than a fortnight. Lewin, disturbed, insisted on an examination. Danehill trembled as he removed his gloves. His pulse raced beneath Lewin's fingers, erratic and forceful. "How often are you using it?" Lewin asked. "Only when the shaking begins," Danehill said quietly. "And when does it begin?" A long pause. "It begins when I stop." Something inside Lewin chilled. He heard the words for what they were: not confession, but warning. That evening, he wrote a letter to a colleague at St. Bartholomew's Hospital, describing the symptoms he had observed. He sealed the envelope with deliberate care, but the next morning, he hesitated before posting it. What if he was mistaken? What if he alarmed the profession unnecessarily? What if ether was merely a modern solution for modern strain? He slipped the letter into a drawer instead. Outside, London carried on, exhausted, determined, and inhaling deeply from bottles purchased with quiet desperation. And though Dr. Lewin continued to offer ether with a gentle recommendation, he understood, at last, that something larger than medicinal convenience was stirring. Something sweet, something cold, something the city had already begun to crave far too much. In the well-appointed houses of Bloomsbury and Kensington, where curtains were pressed stiff and carpets swallowed every footfall, the rhythms of domestic life ran with the discipline of a clock. Meals served at exact hours, lessons delivered with gentle firmness, children ushered up and down staircases like small regiments. And at the quiet center of many such households stood the governess, an invisible pillar who kept order not by authority, but by endurance. Miss Clara Ashcombe had begun her post in the Harrington home 3 years earlier, a young woman of modest means but strong conviction. She carried her responsibilities with grace. Dawn lessons, afternoon walks, stories told by lamplight, needlework when the children slept. But beneath her calm exterior lay a fatigue she could never quite banish. The Harrington children were spirited 2 boys with boundless energy and a girl whose curiosity demanded ceaseless attention. Their mother, delicate in temperament, left most of the emotional labor to Clara. Their father, stern but fair, expected excellence from everyone in his employ. Clara obliged. Clara always obliged. Yet she had not slept soundly in months. The nights stretched thin, each hour marked by thoughts she could not quiet. Lessons to plan, letters unanswered, wages too small to support her aging mother. She lay awake listening to the faint ticking of the hallway clock, her mind restless, her body weary, her nerves drawn taut as violin strings. She feared more than anything the slow trembling that crept into her hands during lessons, trembling that made her feel perilously close to losing both her composure and her livelihood. Then, one morning, she visited Dr. Lewin. Her exhaustion was visible the moment she stepped into his surgery, dark circles, pale lips, shoulders sagging beneath her modest coat. Dr. Lewin, ever gentle, offered her a seat and listened as she explained her sleeplessness, her worry, her struggle to maintain the household's high expectations. "I fear," she whispered, "that if I cannot steady myself, I may lose my position." Lewin hesitated. He had grown increasingly cautious with Ether, but Clara's desperation was unmistakable. He folded a cloth, added the smallest measure of the cold, clear liquid, and raised it to her lips. "Only breathe normally," he murmured. She did. The effect was immediate, an easing, a softening, a sense of strength returning like warmth to chilled limbs. Clara blinked slowly, her breath deepening, her spine straightening. A tear slid down her cheek, not from sorrow, but from relief so profound it startled her. Dr. Lewin gave her a small bottle to take home, accompanied by strict instructions. Use it sparingly, only when the nerves refused to settle. Clara nodded. She meant to obey. But the first night she used ether, she slept more deeply than she had in years. The second night, she used it again, not from necessity, but from fear of waking, anxious and unsteady. The third night, she increased the dose just slightly, certain no harm could come of something so subtle, so restorative. Within a fortnight, the change was visible. Her lessons brimmed with new vitality. She moved with elegance, spoke with confidence, carried herself with a serenity that impressed even Mrs. Harrington. But her eyes shone too brightly now. Her steps were too sharp, too quick, her laughter a touch too light. The children adored this newfound Clara, unaware that beneath her polished exterior was a tension wound tighter each day. By the end of the month, Clara's hands shook not from exhaustion but from absence. The moment ether's cool clarity faded, her thoughts clouded, her breath shortened, dread coiled in her chest. She found herself stepping into the hallway between lessons to steady her nerves, uncorking the bottle with trembling fingers, inhaling with the fervor of someone drinking after long thirst. One evening, as she prepared the children for bed, Clara felt the world narrow. Their chatter grated, their movements seemed too loud, too sudden. She reached into her apron pocket, but the bottle was empty. Her vision blurred, her knees weakened. She gripped the banister to keep from sinking to the floor. The children paused, frightened by her pallor. "Miss Ashcombe, are you ill?" She forced a smile, though her pulse hammered wildly. "Just tired, my dears. Only tired." Later, in the solitude of her small attic room, Clara wept not from shame but from realization. Ether had become her stability, her composure, her nightly salvation. Without it, she felt stripped bare, fragile as thin glass. Yet in the household below, no one suspected the truth. They praised her dedication, admired her renewed vigor. And London, ever skilled at looking away, continued to ignore the quiet unraveling of those who served it. Clara Ashcombe, governess, caretaker, unseen pillar of respectability, had joined the ranks of those who inhaled not for comfort anymore, but for survival. There was a peculiar vanity to Victorian London, an eagerness to dress every new invention, every modern vice, in the graceful costume of progress. Gas lamps glowed like captured stars. Railways thundered with the promise of speed. Even telegrams rattling urgently across the wires were hailed as a civilizing miracle. And in the parlors of respectable homes, those manicured rooms with velvet drapes and marble hearths, ether slipped in as the newest ornament of sophistication. It began discreetly. A hostess in Mayfair, eager to display the latest continental fashion, invited a few intimate friends for an evening of light refreshments and invigorating airs. The phrase, printed on cream-colored invitations, puzzled her guests. But curiosity outweighed caution, as it often did among London's social circles. When they arrived, they found a drawing-room bathed in soft lamplight, French roses arranged in crystal vases, and on a small silver tray half hidden beside decanters of sherry lay a set of delicate glass bottles, each filled with a clear, faintly shimmering liquid. A lace handkerchief rested beside them. Their hostess, Mrs. Davenport, greeted each guest with a gentle laugh. "Only a breath," she murmured, lifting the handkerchief. "A modern remedy for fatigue. The continent adores it. You will feel quite refreshed." The women leaned in cautiously. The first inhalation produced a collective murmur: surprise, relief, a soft gasp of pleasure. The cold sweetness glided through their chests like silk drawn across skin. Eyes widened, shoulders relaxed. A sense of buoyant clarity settled over them. "How delightful," someone whispered. "How restful," another breathed. And just like that, ether entered the parlor. It was the beginning of a new fashion, genteel, discreet, draped in the language of refinement. Over the next weeks, similar scenes unfolded across other homes. Bottles rested beside card tables, half hidden behind porcelain figurines, arranged neatly on pianoforte lids. Women who would never dare to taste spirits in public now inhaled ether openly under the guise of health and rejuvenation. Conversation changed subtly. Voices grew softer, words more fluid. The usual tension beneath polite discourse, jealousies, rivalries, unspoken anxieties melted into something languid and almost dreamy. At one gathering, Lady Rawdon sighed blissfully, fanning herself with a gloved hand. "My nerves have not felt this calm in years." Mrs. Hale, known for her prudishness, leaned forward with surprising boldness. "It is like stepping into clarity. One forgets all one's worries." Her husband later remarked that she had never seemed so agreeable. But beneath the lace and lamplight, a discordant note lingered. Some guests partook too eagerly, inhaling deeply, repeatedly, their eyes brightening into something feverish. A young woman giggled uncontrollably. Another slumped faintly onto a chaise longue, insisting she merely felt light-headed from the warmth. A few men, permitted entry for special occasions, grew unusually talkative, speaking with a sharpness that bordered on manic. Hosts pretended not to notice. Guests pretended not to understand. Servants, observing quietly from doorways, noticed everything. And so ether wove itself into the rituals of polite society. It became a conversation piece when delivered in ornate bottles, a fashionable indulgence at musical evenings, a scientific wonder referenced in hushed tones by physicians eager to appear modern. By the end of spring, parlors across the city smelled faintly of roses, coal smoke, and something colder, an aroma so subtle that only those familiar with it recognized its presence. Ether settled into upholstery, clung to brocade curtains, lingered in the folds of fancy gowns long after the guests departed. But the most telling sign was this. Morning gatherings, once marked by gentle fatigue, now hummed with an unnatural brightness. Eyes sparkled a bit too fiercely. Laughs rang a bit too loudly. Hands trembled only when the inhalations wore off. London society was convinced it had discovered a harmless wonder, a gentle, civilized balm for the restless spirit of the age. But beneath the polished veneer, addiction had begun to bloom like a stain spreading under silk. Ether had become a perfume of progress, and the city inhaled it eagerly, unaware that the sweetness masking its scent carried the first whisper of ruin. In the Harrington household on Fleet Street, one of those tall, narrow buildings squeezed between a solicitor's office and a print shop, a quiet domestic order reigned. Mrs. Eleanor Harrington kept her home with meticulous care, arranging fresh flowers each morning, sewing by the parlor window each afternoon, and waiting faithfully for her husband, Mr. Thomas Harrington, senior editor of the London Courier, to return from the presses each night. She had grown accustomed to his lateness. She had grown accustomed to his exhaustion. But she had not grown accustomed to the strangeness that crept into him that spring. Thomas had always been a serious man, measured, thoughtful, with a mind sharpened by decades of editing. But lately his sharpness had taken on a peculiar edge. He returned home with eyes too bright, hands too still, speech too rapid. His footsteps on the stair were either too heavy or too light, never the familiar, steady tread she knew so well. "Long night?" she would ask gently. He always replied, "A productive one," and kissed her cheek with a strange, distracted warmth. One night, when he arrived later than usual, Eleanor noticed something else, a faint, cold sweetness drifting from his coat. Not perfume, not drink. Something unfamiliar, almost medicinal, yet oddly pleasant. It clung to him, lingering even as he removed his jacket and sat down by the fire. "Have you seen a physician?" she ventured. "No need," he replied, pouring himself tea with mechanical precision. "Thomas, you look pale." "I have never been clearer." The conversation ended there, as most things did when Thomas decided they should. But Eleanor's unease deepened with each passing night. She noted how he locked his study door, how he grew irritable if she entered unexpectedly, how he insisted on working long after midnight, only to rise at dawn with unnatural vigor. A fortnight later, while tidying his study in his absence, she found it. The bottle lay half hidden beneath a stack of proof sheets, its blue label catching the afternoon light like a shard of frost. Eleanor lifted it carefully, heart tightening as she examined it. The liquid within was clear, almost luminous. A faint, sweet chill escaped the moment she eased the cork free, so soft she nearly doubted her senses. But then the scent blossomed. A sweetness cold as winter's breath. The same scent that had clung to her husband each night. Her hands trembled not with clumsiness, but with the gravity of recognition. Something was wrong, terribly wrong. Footsteps sounded in the hallway. She hurriedly replaced the cork, set the bottle down, and stepped back, just as Thomas entered the room. He froze. For a moment, husband and wife stared at one another with a silence as heavy as snow. "You've been touching my things," he said softly. Not angry, worse. Cold. "I was only tidying." "Did you open it?" His eyes were too bright now, their clarity unnatural. "I noticed the scent." "Thomas, what is it?" He moved forward, taking the bottle into his hand as though shielding it. "A remedy for the nerves, perfectly harmless." "It doesn't smell harmless." "It is safer than brandy," he snapped. "Safer than coffee. Safer than the damn city we live in." Eleanor flinched. He had never spoken to her so sharply. Thomas closed his eyes, exhaled, and softened his tone. "Forgive me. It has been a demanding season." She reached for his arm. "Thomas, whatever this is, it's changing you." He pulled away. "It is helping me," he insisted. "Helping me think, helping me work. I am more precise than ever. The paper has never been stronger. You have never been more distant." The words struck him harder than she intended. For a moment, the old Thomas, the gentle, steady one, flickered across his face. Then the brightness returned, hard and unyielding. "This conversation is finished," he said, locking the bottle in his desk drawer. "Please do not touch my things again." He left the room, footsteps retreating with unsettling calm. Eleanor remained standing in the doorway long after he had gone, her hands clasped tightly before her. She did not cry. She did not panic. But she felt a coldness settle into her chest, a coldness eerily similar to the sweetness that lingered in the air. Ether had entered their home, not as medicine, not as curiosity, but as an intruder. And Eleanor understood, with a clarity that chilled her. She was losing her husband one breath at a time. They were the youngest souls on Fleet Street, the print boys darting through the maze of alleyways with ink on their cuffs and ambition in their strides. Barely into their teens, they performed the invisible labor that kept the newspapers breathing, fetching type, carrying proofs between floors, delivering bundles to shop fronts before dawn. Their laughter, thin and bright, once echoed through the press rooms like small bursts of sunlight. But by early summer, the brightness began to dim. It began with Thomas Reed, a boy of 14 whose speed was admired even by the foreman. He could weave through the machinery without hesitation, delivering orders with the efficiency of a messenger twice his age. But one morning, he arrived late, his steps slow, his cheeks unusually pale. When the foreman scolded him, Thomas only nodded politely and set to work, but his eyes had lost their spark. By midday, he swayed where he stood. Harrow noticed him leaning against a stack of type trays, his breath shallow, his small hands trembling in the way grown men trembled before reaching for a blue bottle. Harrow approached with a concerned frown. "You're looking faint, lad," he murmured. Thomas managed a weak smile. "Only tired, sir." But the lie was too thin to hold. His complexion had taken on the same ashy paleness Harrow had seen too often in the printers, the men who sought clarity in cold sweetness, who steadied themselves with something that demanded more from them each day. And Thomas smelled faintly of it. Not strongly, not as an adult might, but enough for a man familiar with the scent to recognize its chilling trace. Harrow knelt to meet the boy's eye. "Who gave it to you?" Thomas shook his head quickly, fear widening his gaze. "No one gave me anything." But later that night, as the presses thundered toward the morning edition, Harrow caught sight of something that confirmed his suspicion. A small handkerchief tucked behind a crate near the alley door, still damp, still fragrant with ether. The cloth was far too coarse to belong to any editor or compositor. It was the kind issued to the print boys for wiping spills. Harrow's stomach tightened. The boys had found the bottles. It spread faster than gossip among them. Ether offered everything they lacked: energy for long shifts, escape from exhaustion, a momentary bloom of courage. And the boys, who were paid pennies and treated like shadows, found themselves suddenly sharper, braver, more capable of keeping pace with the brutal tempo of Fleet Street. But the vapor was not meant for children. Soon enough, small changes became impossible to ignore. A boy stumbled while carrying a bundle of proofs. Another fell asleep upright in the stairwell, cheek pressed against cold stone. Their laughter, once lively, turned brittle and short-lived. Their faces grew paler, their eyes glassy, their steps unsteady. Percival Finch witnessed one boy collapse behind the presses, legs folding beneath him as though his bones had momentarily forgotten their purpose. When Percival lifted him, the child's pulse fluttered wildly, a frantic beat beneath his cold skin. Dr. Mansfield was summoned that evening. He examined the boy quietly, his face growing graver with each passing moment. After a long silence, he spoke the dreaded confirmation. "He has been inhaling ether." The press room, usually alive with noise, fell unbearably still. "Who introduced him to it?" the foreman demanded, voice sharp with fury and fear. The boy, half conscious, whispered a name, the surname of a compositor known for slipping out to the alley too often, for raising the bottle too freely when his nerves frayed. Harrow closed his eyes. He knew it would come to this. The men could barely control their own use. How could the children resist something so deceptively gentle? Word spread quickly among the staff. Some reacted with outrage, others with guilt, others with a fearful tightening in their chests. But none could deny the truth. The print boys, Fleet Street's youngest workers, its hopeful apprentices, were slipping into dependency before they were old enough to understand it. That week, 3 more boys were found pale and trembling. One admitted to taking deep breaths to keep up with the men. Another said it made the long nights less frightening. A third confessed he used it because everyone else seemed stronger than me. Fleet Street had always demanded sacrifices, but never had it demanded breath itself. And in the shadowed corners of the press rooms, where the boys once gathered to share jokes and dreams of becoming reporters, Small blue bottles now gleamed like dangerous toys, too accessible, too tempting, too silently destructive. London pretended not to notice the grown men who inhaled ether. But the sight of children doing the same? Even denial had its limits. Yet the city, master of elegant blindness, merely turned its gaze a little sharper, and then, just as quickly, looked away. St. Bartholomew's Hospital had always carried its own distinct fragrance, a mingling of antiseptic spirits, boiled linens, and the faint iron tang of blood. But by midsummer, another scent began weaving its way through the corridors, a cold, sugary note that did not belong in any sick room. It drifted softly beneath doors, clung stubbornly to curtains, and lingered in the breaths of patients who should not have smelled of anything except broth and laudanum. The nurses noticed first. Nurse Collings, sharp-eyed and brisk, halted outside the women's convalescence ward one evening. She inhaled slowly, frowning at the chill sweetness that brushed her senses. It reminded her of frost on window panes, except warmer, more perfumed, more deliberate. She pushed open the ward door and scanned the rows of beds. Most patients lay in silence, their faces pale against the bleached pillows. But one woman, a laundress recovering from a minor operation, sat upright with a peculiar brightness in her expression, her pupils wide, her breathing slowed to a serene rhythm. When Nurse Collings approached, the woman smiled dreamily. "Feeling improved, Mrs. Vale?" "Oh yes, nurse," she murmured. "The air is quite pleasant tonight." Pleasant, in a hospital ward that smelled faintly of ether. Collings moved to the next bed. A clerk recovering from exhaustion slept unnaturally deeply, chest rising and falling as though lulled by invisible hands. Another patient, who had earlier complained of tremors, now lay perfectly still, a contented expression softening his features. But the most troubling sight was at the far corner. A young man recently admitted for a broken arm, now holding a folded cloth to his face, eyes half closed in blissful withdrawal from the world. The cloth unmistakably smelled of ether. Collings' heart drummed sharply. She snatched it from him. "Where did you get this?" His answer was slow, dreamy. "A kind gentleman across the ward said it helps the dreams stay quiet." She followed his gaze to a man 2 beds over, a typesetter from Fleet Street, who had been admitted after fainting on the job. She recognized him immediately for the marks on his cuffs, for the chemical scent that rose from him like a second skin. Dr. Mansfield had warned her a week earlier that ether use was spreading beyond surgeons and into unsuitable hands. At the time, she had listened politely, assuming he exaggerated. But now, standing amid patients who seemed both soothed and sickened by the same substance, she understood. The ward was breathing ether. Not because the doctors prescribed it, at least not most of them, but because patients were smuggling it in. Word of its calming effects had traveled. Men recovering from injury sought it for steadiness. Women used it to soothe their anxieties under the guise of medication. A nurse's aide admitted privately that a few patients offered extra pennies for a tiny vial hidden in the folds of their sheets. And the hospital, overburdened, understaffed, exhausted, had failed to notice. That night, Dr. Mansfield made his rounds with deeper concern than ever before. He paused at each bed, examining dilated pupils, unnatural placidity, breaths that were too deep, too slow. When he reached the typesetter, the man attempted to sit up, only to sink back with disoriented lethargy. "How long have you been using ether?" Mansfield asked quietly. The man's lips twitched into something like a smile, long enough to forget the shaking. Mansfield stepped back, his expression darkening. He surveyed the entire ward, a room filled not only with the sick and injured, but with souls entranced by a chemical comfort they were never meant to rely upon. Outside, Nurse Collings waited with the confiscated cloth in her hands. "What do we do, doctor?" she whispered. Mansfield's answer came slowly. "We try to stop it, though I fear we are already too late." And he was right. because ether had not merely entered the hospital, it had colonized it. It whispered through the corridors, slipped beneath bedsheets, calmed trembling hands, only to claim them more fiercely later. Patients who arrived recovering from broken bones or exhaustion left with something far more insidious, a hunger for the cold sweetness that had soothed them in their weakest moments. St. Bartholomew's, once a sanctuary of healing, now harbored a quiet epidemic, a frost-scented ward where desperation met opportunity, and the line between remedy and ruin blurred beneath the steady glow of gas lamps. London might have ignored ether in the presses, in the clubs, in the parlours, but if it was now thriving in its hospitals, then the city faced a danger far deeper than fashion or fatigue. For sickness could be cured, but dependence? That was a far more stubborn illness. And ether had already begun its silent takeover. Reverend Samuel Brayton had always been a man of unwavering composure. In his pulpit at St. Hallow's Chapel, he spoke with a voice that soothed the anxious, steadied the doubtful, and reassured the weary. His sermons flowed like warm tea poured on a cold morning, gentle, measured, anchoring. Parishioners trusted him not only for his faith, but for his calm authority, the sense that he saw clearly even when the world trembled. But by the time ether had seeped into the veins of London life, Reverend Brayton's composure carried a strain no one else could see. It began with a tremor small, almost imperceptible, a faint vibration in his right hand whenever he turned a page of scripture. At first, he dismissed it. Age, he thought. Fatigue. Too many evenings spent writing sermons by lamplight. But the tremor grew bolder each week, tugging at his fingers like an impatient spirit, making his pen wobble, making his voice falter even as he tried to steady it with prayer. His congregation did not notice the change, not at first. They saw only the same composed figure, his clerical collar perfectly straight, his hands raised in blessing. But beneath his cassock sleeve, the tremor persisted, like a quiet warning. Reverend Brayton confided in no one until the night he visited Dr. Lewin. The doctor received him kindly, though he had suspected for some time that the city's endless burdens were creeping into even the most disciplined souls. The Reverend explained the tremor, the sleeplessness, the sudden surges of restlessness that stole into his mind during prayer. "I lose my words," he admitted softly. "There is a moment just before I speak, when my thoughts scatter like frightened birds." Lewin hesitated, then presented the same remedy he had offered so many others. A cloth, a drop, a breath of ether, cold and deceptively gentle. The Reverend inhaled. The tremor stilled instantly. His mind cleared. His breath deepened, and a serene warmth, unnatural but glorious, settled through him like divine quiet. "God forgive me," he whispered, eyes closing. "I had forgotten what stillness feels like." Lewin warned him, as he always did, only in sparing doses. Brayton nodded with solemn earnestness. "Of course. But even the most pious of men are mortal, and mortal men cling tightly to what restores them." Within a week, he requested a small bottle for emergencies. Within 2, he used it before every sermon. Within 3, he could not bring himself to climb the pulpit stairs without first feeling the cold sigh of ether slide through his lungs. His parishioners noticed a new brilliance in him, an uncanny clarity, an almost luminous intensity in his preaching. His voice took on a bell-like resonance. His eyes glistened with fervor. His gestures flowed with unexpected grace. "Reverend Brayton has never spoken better," they whispered. But the truth hid beneath his robe. His hands shook violently until the moment he inhaled. The tremor returned with vengeance whenever the ether wore off. Prayer no longer soothed him. Scripture no longer steadied him. His faith remained intact, but his body had grown dependent on something far less sacred. One Sunday morning, just minutes before the service, the Reverend opened his study drawer only to find his bottle nearly empty. Panic, sharp, unholy, clawed at his chest. His trembling grew so severe he could scarcely grasp his sermon notes. He paced the room, breath shallow, heart pounding. When he finally stepped into the sanctuary, the congregation rose expectantly, but the man who greeted them was ghost pale, his hands shaking beneath the folds of his sleeves. He delivered the sermon with visible strain. His voice cracked, sweat gathered at his temple, words slipped from his grasp, returning only after long, disorienting pauses. Afterward, several parishioners approached with concern. "Are you unwell, Reverend? Shall we fetch a physician? You look chilled to the bone." Brayton smiled faintly, but his eyes were hollow. That night, alone in his study, he stared at the near-empty bottle. His hand shook as he lifted it, but he forced himself to set it back down. He prayed long into the small hours, pleading for strength, for healing, for deliverance from the very comfort he had embraced. But the tremor returned with punishing insistence, a reminder that ether granted peace only to demand it back tenfold. And in the quiet of St. Hallow's Chapel, where candles flickered like anxious souls, Reverend Brayton understood a terrible truth. Even faith resolute, disciplined, enduring, was not immune to the cold sweetness seeping through London. Even he had begun to slip. Even he was breathing something he could no longer easily refuse. The city's epidemic had reached its pulpits, and the tremor was only beginning. The Thames had always carried London's secrets. Its waters swallowed confessions whispered beneath bridges, bore away the refuse of factories, and reflected the wavering glow of gas lamps that hid more sins than they illuminated. But by autumn, a new kind of whisper drifted along the embankment, faint at first, then gathering like fog curling over the river. It began with the boatmen. They worked the river from dawn's thin blue to night's deep black, rowing passengers across its restless surface. Theirs was a trade that demanded strength, stamina, and a keen eye for danger. Yet boatmen began muttering in low, uneasy voices about gentlemen who boarded their skiffs with glassy eyes and unsteady steps, men who insisted they were merely overtired, though their breath smelled faintly of winter sweetness. One night, old Rowan Pike, who had rowed the Thames for half a century, guided a well-dressed clerk across the choppy water. The man sat motionless, hands folded neatly in his lap, staring blankly ahead. Halfway across, Pike noticed the clerk's lips turning pale, his breathing slow and shallow. "You all right, sir?" Pike asked. The man did not answer. He simply swayed, then slumped sideways, barely caught by the boatman before he toppled into the river's cold embrace. When Pike checked his pockets for identification, his fingers brushed something smooth, a small bottle with a blue label, still warm from the man's grasp. Pike told no one officially, but his story drifted among river workers like a chill wind. Soon other boatmen added their own tales. A barrister who couldn't stand without assistance, a journalist who tumbled onto the dock while insisting he was perfectly clear-minded, a pale young woman who clutched her reticule as though it carried salvation. By week's end, men who loaded cargo swore they had seen respectable clerks stumbling near the water's edge with a strange, icy calmness, as if walking in a dream. Dock workers joked nervously that London's thinking men were becoming sleepwalkers. Rumours spread faster than the tide. Along the embankment cafes, patrons spoke in hushed tones about an epidemic of faintness. Police constables traded uneasy glances as they described late-night wanderers whose steps faltered dangerously close to the river's edge. A lamplighter claimed he saw two men lighting their way with trembling hands, their heads bowed as if fighting invisible dizziness. And then there was the case of Miss Eleanor Voss. A shopgirl returning home at dusk, she was found collapsed against the stone balustrade near Blackfriars Bridge, her shawl slipping dangerously toward the water. A constable rushed to her aid. When she revived, she whispered that she had felt strange, that her thoughts had grown too bright, then suddenly darkened. The constable found a small cloth in her pocket, still damp with a familiar scent. He didn't report it. not properly. The station was tired of hearing words without laws to support them. But the whispers thickened. Newspapers along the riverfront printed vague concerns about widespread exhaustion among professionals. Physicians offered gentle reassurance that the city was suffering nothing uncommon. But the men who knew the river best, the boatmen, the dockhands, the lamplighters, recognized something else entirely. "These folk aren't exhausted," Pike muttered one night, staring out at the black water. "They're hollowing out. Something's pulling at them, quiet as the tide." One evening, a barge crew pulled a half-conscious man from the river's edge. His coat was soaked, his pulse weak. When they emptied his pockets, a blue-labeled bottle slid across the deck. The crew exchanged grim looks. "Another one," someone murmured. The Thames, which had always been patient with London's follies, now watched silently as citizens wandered dangerously close to its depths, drawn by exhaustion, by dizziness, or perhaps by something colder. And just as the fog along the embankment hid the lamplighter's path, ether hid its victim's slow decline, masking it with a strange clarity until the moment their knees buckled. London pretended it did not see the change. But the river saw everything. And the river knew. The city was slipping. One sweet, icy breath at a time. In the polished drawing rooms and private offices of London's professional elite, a certain image was carefully maintained: men of intellect, restraint, and impeccable self-command. Their cuffs were crisp, their boots shined, their thoughts orderly as ledger lines. These were the men who set the city's tempo. Barristers, financiers, editors, architects, brokers. They prided themselves on discipline, on the quiet dignity of rational control. And yet, by early autumn, even these paragons of restraint found themselves yielding quietly, elegantly to the same cold sweetness that had crept through Fleet Street's basements and hospital wards. It began with Mr. Lawrence Ashford, senior partner at the prestigious law firm of Ashford and Bellamy. He had always been a model of composure, never raising his voice, never missing a deadline, never faltering in court. But as the legal season intensified and cases multiplied, Ashford began excusing himself from meetings with increasing frequency. No one questioned him. Seniority offered certain allowances. But behind the heavy oak door of his office, Ashford would close the blinds, remove his spectacles, and reach into the second drawer of his desk. There lay a small blue bottle wrapped in handkerchief linen. He would uncork it with trembling fingers, inhale sharply, and feel the tension melt from his mind like frost undone by the sun. Within minutes, he emerged calm, brilliant, sharper than before, astonishing even his junior partners with the precision of his arguments. They admired him. They envied him. And a few, quietly, asked where he found such composure. Ashford never answered directly, but the glimmer in his eye was enough. Soon, 2 more partners acquired bottles of their own. Then a third. Then a clerk, burdened by deadlines, slipped into the habit. The law firm's corridors began to smell faintly, almost imperceptibly, of cold sweetness, masked beneath the polish of respectability. Similar scenes unfolded across London's intellectual bastions. At the Royal Institute of Architecture, draftsmen whispered that certain colleagues could work through the night without blinking, designing entire building facades in a single sitting, their pens gliding with almost supernatural steadiness. At the Exchange, brokers praised a colleague whose nerves, once notoriously fragile, were now steady as steel even in the most volatile markets. At the publishing house of Carmichael Brothers, the senior editor, famed for his meticulous eye, began producing immaculate proofs at a startling pace, scarcely pausing to rest. In each case, the pattern was identical. A man would withdraw behind a private door. A faint, sweet chill would drift beneath the gap, and he would emerge renewed, clear, focused, almost radiant. But the brilliance came with a shadow. Ashford, for all his newfound vigor, grew strangely anxious when he misplaced his bottle. His composure cracked whenever delays prevented his solitary retreats. On one memorable afternoon, he snapped at a junior clerk for knocking an outburst so out of character that the entire office froze. Later that evening, he apologized profusely, but his apology trembled at the edges like a man apologizing through clenched teeth. At the architecture firm, one draftsman collapsed in the washroom, his ruler slipping from his hand as consciousness wavered. When colleagues found him, he insisted he had merely skipped lunch, though the faint scent surrounding him told another story. At the exchange, the broker whose nerves had become steel was spotted early one morning gripping the banister with white-knuckled desperation, his breath shallow, his pupils dilated. All of them swore they were simply tired, overworked, in need of rest. London accepted the lie. London always accepted respectable lies. Because what would the city do if it admitted that its brightest minds, its arbiters of law, finance, architecture, and literature, had found themselves tethered to a substance so deceptively gentle? Admit that their brilliance was no longer entirely their own? Admit that progress was being fueled not only by intellect, but by a chemical breath that dulled and sharpened in equal measure? No, better to look away. And so London pretended the gentlemen were simply rising to meet the demands of a modern age, even as the bottles multiplied in desk drawers, coat pockets, and private clubs. Men who had once prided themselves on iron discipline now clung, quietly and privately, to a cold sweetness they could not resist. And with every breath, the illusion of control thinned, until even the most respectable among them began to sense the truth. They were no longer masters of their clarity. They were borrowers, and the debt was quietly, steadily growing. By the turn of October, London had become a city that inhaled more than air. It inhaled escape quietly, sweetly, beneath the clatter of carriages and the hum of commerce. Ether drifted through its streets like an unseen fog, not enough to alarm, not enough to scandalize, but enough to soften the edges of fatigue, blur the sting of disappointment, and cradle its citizens with an artificial calm they soon found indispensable. No one announced that London had changed. No decree was posted. No pamphlet warned of danger. And yet, the symptoms pulsed everywhere for those who cared to look. In tea rooms, patrons lingered longer than before, not over the tea itself, but over small glass bottles tucked discreetly beside their saucers. Women dipped lace handkerchiefs into the liquid with practiced elegance, holding the cloth to their lips while murmuring about fashion or household troubles. A few blushed as the cold sweetness slid down their throats. Another few fainted lightly, claiming the air had grown too warm. In omnibuses, passengers sat in preserved silence, judging one another by the steadiness of their hands rather than their clothing. A man with trembling fingers was assumed overworked. A man with too perfect composure was assumed to have taken something to ensure it. Londoners had created, without ever speaking it aloud, a new metric for social respectability, the balance between exhaustion and unnatural calm. Clerks at the post offices moved faster, sorting letters with feverish precision until the moment their breath caught and their knees weakened, at which point they muttered apologies, fled to the lavatory, and returned with a steadiness that betrayed its source. Even children sensed the shift. They watched adults with curious suspicion, whispering about the smell that followed some of them, like cold sugar or like winter inside a bottle. Nurses and governesses snapped at them for asking questions, the irritation dissolving, moments later, into an eerie gentleness. In the evenings, London's theatres filled with patrons whose faces glowed too brightly in the gaslight. They applauded with unnatural enthusiasm. They wept with unrestrained emotion. They left the halls in unstable silence, swaying ever so slightly as they stepped onto the cobblestones. But perhaps the most sobering change unfolded in the city's language itself. Ether was never mentioned outright, not in polite company, not in crude tavern talk, not even in the privacy of a marital bedroom. Instead, Londoners invented euphemisms: a restorative, a little courage, a breath of clarity, a touch of frost. The phrases passed easily down the city's throat, swallowed like truth. Even those unaffected felt its presence, the way one feels a chill without knowing its source. A laundress complained her mistress had grown too calm to trust. A stable boy said his employer walked like he was floating. A seamstress reported that half her clients no longer blinked at the correct times. The city's pulse had changed. Its tempo had sharpened, then unsteadied. Its people moved with a strange mixture of clarity and collapse. Yet London told itself a comforting lie, that the exhaustion was the disease, and ether the cure. Dr. Mansfield, walking home one fog-laden evening, observed two gentlemen leaning unsteadily against a lamppost, their breath visible in the cold air. Their conversation was bright, too bright, each sentence tripping over the next. Mansfield recognized the signs and felt a heaviness settle in his chest. London was not merely using ether. London was depending on it. Factories, offices, boarding houses, and private clubs all hummed with an invisible thread of craving so gentle it felt like habit, so dangerous it escaped recognition. The city, in its desperation to soothe its nerves, had begun to sicken itself. Slowly, elegantly, respectably. And like all illnesses that take root in silence, this one spread without resistance, its symptoms mistaken for productivity, its dangers disguised as progress. London inhaled to steady itself. London exhaled with relief. And with every breath, the sweetness tightened its quiet hold. The inquest was held in a room pressed into the corner of an aging courthouse, where gas lamps flickered against damp plaster and the walls seemed to absorb every whispered fear. Fleet Street itself was only a few blocks away, yet the hum of presses felt impossibly distant, as though the city had shrunk and the alleyways led into another, quieter world, a world that smelled faintly of ink, coal, and something colder, something sweet. It began with the body of a compositor named Felix Mallory. He had been found collapsed behind his typesetting bench, a blue-labeled bottle lying beside him, still glistening faintly in the gaslight of the press room. Colleagues reported he had seemed unusually bright in the hours before, steady as a man could ever be. And then, without warning, he had fallen, lifeless but for the shallow rhythm of his breath, which failed to recover despite frantic attempts by fellow printers. The coroner, a gaunt man with sharp spectacles and the patience of stone, presided over the room. His voice, calm and deliberate, carried a weight that silenced even the murmuring crowd. "We are here to determine cause. No conjecture. Only evidence." But the air was thick with more than expectation. It carried the cold, faint perfume of ether, the lingering reminder of all who had relied on it before him. Witnesses were called. Harrow, usually composed to the point of monotony, stepped forward first. He described Mallory's steady work, his small tremors that were usually kept in check, and the introduction of the bottle, the very first blue-labeled vial to enter the presses. His voice trembled only slightly, though his eyes remained fixed on the coroner. He used it sparingly at first, Harrow admitted, but the use became necessary. He could not work without it. Other printers followed. Each account traced a subtle decline, an almost imperceptible slide into dependence that no man had wished to name aloud. The boy's hands, once steady, began to shake. One muttered, and yet he kept using it, for focus, for calm, until the night he fell. A physician, called to the scene, testified with solemnity. Dr. Lewin described the effects of ether in terms precise enough to chill the listeners. A fleeting calm, a cold clarity, and the inevitable rebound, the trembling, the anxious heartbeat, the faint pallor that followed each inhalation. "It is a substance not wholly harmless," he said quietly. "It steadies, only to demand return. It soothes, only to claim more than it gives. Outside the room, the city carried on. Horse-drawn carriages rattled over the cobblestones. Gas lamps burned low in the fog. And yet within the walls of the inquest, an uneasy hush lingered over the witnesses. Men who had never admitted weakness, who had prized their discipline above all, now spoke of trembling hands and quiet dependence. The truth, once invisible, had taken form. Mrs. Harrington, sitting near the back, listened with a pang of understanding she had not known she possessed. Her husband, Thomas, editor of the Courier, had begun to rely on the same cold comfort to steady his hands in the office. She thought of the faint sweetness that clung to him when he returned home late each night, the way his composure sharpened unnaturally, the way his eyes glistened with intensity that was not entirely his own. Now she knew, beyond speculation, that the danger was real. The coroner concluded with deliberate care. Cause of death complications arising from excessive inhalation of a volatile restorative, accidental yet inevitable in the circumstances. His words fell like lead. A quiet shudder passed through the room. The men and women who had relied on the substance or who had seen colleagues rely on it felt the weight of inevitability settle upon their shoulders. Fleet Street had claimed another. A bright young life had been lost. And the city, so practiced in denial, had no one to blame but itself. The inquest ended, the witnesses dispersed, and the press resumed its relentless rhythm outside. Yet the room remained haunted, a subtle frost lingering in the corners, a silent reminder that the pursuit of steadiness could so easily tip into ruin. And London inhaled, once more, unaware of how dangerously close it had come. The House of Commons had never been more crowded nor more restless than on the grey afternoon when the matter of ether use on Fleet Street was first brought to its attention. Gas lamps flickered through the high windows, casting elongated shadows across oak benches polished smooth by centuries of debate. The air was thick with anticipation and something else, something faint, like frost mixed with sugar, as though the city outside had crept inside to remind the lawmakers of what they had long ignored. It began with Mr. Alverstone, a member of Parliament representing a district near the heart of the printing trade. His voice, measured yet urgent, echoed against the chamber's walls. "Gentlemen," he said, eyes sweeping the benches, "it has come to my attention that a dangerous substance has infiltrated our city, one that affects not only the health of workers, but their very faculties. Fleet Street, the pride of London's press, has become compromised." A murmur ran through the chamber. Murmurs were common in Parliament, but this one carried unease, a hint of disbelief. Some men frowned, others shifted in their seats. They had dealt with scandal before, with disorderly pressmen and labour disputes, but the idea that their brightest, most disciplined citizens were imperilled by a chemical was unprecedented. "Sir," interjected Mr. Linton, a lawyer accustomed to defence and delay, "are we certain this is more than mere rumour? Fleet Street has always been vigorous, and its men are accustomed to long hours and late nights." Alverstone's eyes, sharp as the blade of a quill, cut across the chamber. "I speak not of rumour, but of documented cases. Deaths have occurred, accidents, witness testimony from physicians. Inquests have been held. And yet, the substance ether continues to circulate freely, without regulation or oversight." Another voice rose, hesitant at first. Mr. Granville, representing the city's printers, cleared his throat. "I do not deny the presence of this substance," he said slowly. "But one must consider, are we not meddling in the methods by which men sustain themselves in the relentless demands of the press?" The words fell like frost upon the chamber. A few nodded discreetly, perhaps recalling their own late nights, their own quiet inhalations that had sharpened a mind or steadied a hand. The debate wavered between concern for public health and fear of exposing private indulgence. Alverstone pressed on. "Gentlemen, it is no longer a matter of private indulgence. The printers' apprentices, Young boys, barely 14, are now using it. Clerks, governesses, even physicians, none immune to the subtle pull. London's industrious men and women are slowly becoming dependent. The city, gentlemen, is soothing itself sick. The chamber grew uneasy. Some MPs shifted in their seats, others leaned forward, whispers exchanged like confidential letters. A gentleman with a polished wig muttered, "We have relied on discretion too long." Perhaps too long indeed. Yet action was difficult. Many MPs themselves had reason to look away. A few men had tasted the same cold clarity in their offices late at night, when reports needed finishing or correspondence demanded perfection. To regulate ether was to acknowledge a peril that touched the lives of the city's most respectable figures, including themselves. After hours of debate, the House adjourned without resolution. The evidence had been laid bare, the testimonies delivered, the warnings sounded, yet no bill was passed. No oversight was imposed. Parliament, a body accustomed to solemn pronouncements and decisive action, had chosen hesitation over judgment, preferring polite silence to confrontation. Outside, the fog pressed against Westminster Bridge, horse-drawn carriages rattled over cobblestones, and London, unaware that the city's pulse had already been altered, continued to inhale, quietly, endlessly, the cold, sweet vapour that Parliament had been unwilling to name. Fleet Street remained unregulated. The presses thundered on, and the chemical that steadied trembling hands continued its silent conquest, its influence creeping ever outward, imperceptible yet inexorable, a whisper beneath the roar of the city. The Press Tavern on Paternoster Row had always been a refuge for Fleet Street's men, a narrow, dimly lit establishment where the smell of roasted coffee beans mingled with smoke from cheap cigars, and the clatter of mugs and type metal collided in chaotic harmony. Here, compositors, editors, and errand boys congregated after a long night, letting fatigue loosen their tongues, sharing anecdotes that would never appear in print. It was a place of camaraderie, of whispers, of laughter tinged with exhaustion. But one evening in late autumn, the tavern became the stage for something far more revealing than gossip or inebriated jest. It began quietly, with Thomas Harrow, who had been unusually subdued all day. He sat alone at a corner table, polishing his spectacles with the same deliberate care he used when arranging type. Around him, others joked, argued about headlines, and shared faintly exaggerated tales of the night's misadventures. Yet Harrow's gaze remained fixed on the small blue bottle cradled in his palm, a bottle he had once considered merely a tool, now an anchor to his frailty. One of the younger compositors, Percival Finch, approached, cheeks flushed from cold and exertion. "Harrow," he said quietly, "you look different tonight, steadier than usual." Harrow's lips twitched into a faint smile, but there was no warmth in his eyes. "I have found an aid," he admitted, almost reluctantly. His voice, low and measured, carried across the tavern in a way that silenced the surrounding chatter. "Something to steady the hands, to clear the mind. It is nothing extraordinary, merely necessary." A hush fell over the room. The men at nearby tables exchanged glances. Some smirked nervously, others stiffened, recognizing the gravity behind the words. Fleet Street, accustomed to bravado, was not used to confession. Harrow continued, leaning forward, voice dropping further. "I was hesitant at first, but without it, I could not meet the hours demanded of us. I feared my hands would falter, my mind would fail, and so I took it." He paused, letting the admission settle like dust over the tavern. "I am not alone. Most of us are now dependent. We call it a breath for clarity, a remedy for nerves, but it is no mere comfort. It is a chain we place upon ourselves." A young man sitting near the hearth choked back a laugh, disbelief and recognition mingling. "You mean the bottle? The blue one?" Harrow nodded. "Yes. It is cold, sweet, and it does not release you freely." The tavern's air grew thick, the usual smoke and warmth feeling almost suffocating in the face of such revelations. Conversations ceased mid-sentence. Mugs were set down with more force than intended. Even the barkeep, who had witnessed the antics of Fleet Street for decades, drew back behind his counter, eyebrows raised. A silence fell that carried with it an unspoken acknowledgement. The city's industrious men, those who prided themselves on discipline, precision, and intellect, were now enslaved by the very remedy meant to sustain them. Harrow's confession was both shocking and relieving. Some men nodded slowly, murmuring their own private admissions. Others averted their eyes, afraid to confront the truth within themselves. The younger compositors, who had idolized their seniors, felt a mixture of fear and resignation, understanding that mastery over one's hands, one's thoughts, had been purchased at a price few could measure. By the end of the evening, the tavern returned to its usual rhythm. Laughter resumed, cigars burned low, mugs clinked. Yet the memory of Harrow's words lingered, heavier than the scent of roasted coffee or the warmth of the hearth. Fleet Street had confessed, if only quietly, and London, outside the tavern walls, remained oblivious. The city continued to breathe in, inhaling the fog, the coal smoke, the chill sweetness of ether, its pulse steadied artificially, its brilliance borrowed, and its vulnerability now plain to those who dared to see. In the shadows of the Press Tavern, a chain had been named, and Fleet Street had learned, at last, the cost of steadiness. The Harrington household had always been a model of order, its polished floors and neatly swept hearths a testament to discipline and propriety. Housemaids moved silently along the corridors, their footsteps light against the polished wood, carrying coal, hot water, and the occasional note of gossip. They were invisible threads holding the domestic machinery together, keeping the household smooth and unbroken. Yet, in late autumn, even this well-ordered world could not escape the quiet intrusions of ether. It was Alice Merriweather, a young housemaid with keen eyes and a careful mind, who stumbled upon the first sign. She had risen before dawn to prepare the morning tea, polishing silver and setting fine china in careful rows. The house was still hushed, the curtains drawn against the chill, and the only sound was the soft whistle of steam from the kettle. As Alice passed the study, a faint sweetness tickled her senses, cold and sharp, almost like frost in the throat. She paused, drawing back the curtain slightly, and saw Mr. Thomas Harrington sitting at his desk, the gas lamp casting a long shadow across the floor. In his hand was the small blue bottle she had seen only once before, half hidden among stacks of correspondence and proofs. Curiosity wrestled with fear. She had been taught to mind her station, to keep secrets and observe discretion. Yet the sight before her was disquieting. The bottle was uncorked. Thomas had leaned back in his chair, eyes closed, a soft exhalation escaping his lips. The tremor in his hand, the one she had noticed the other evening, had vanished entirely, replaced by a steadiness that seemed almost unnatural. Alice's heart thumped sharply. She did not move, did not breathe too loudly, but as she lingered, the door shifted slightly under her hand, and the creak echoed faintly through the room. Harrington's eyes opened, catching her glance. A flicker of guilt crossed his expression, quickly replaced by composed calm. "This is nothing," he said smoothly, though the words were sharper than intended. "Merely a restorative, a little air to steady the hands during long hours." Alice nodded silently, retreating down the corridor, but her mind whirled. She had seen enough. She had smelled enough. The truth pressed against her like the fog outside. Even in the home of the respectable, the ether had woven itself into private life. In the following days, Alice began to notice more. Small cloths tucked into waistcoat pockets, faint whiffs of sweetness lingering in hallways, servants hushed conversations when they thought no one listened. Even the cook, Mrs. Brindle, seemed unusually serene in the mornings, humming quietly while preparing breakfast, hands steady despite the early hour and the heavy kettles. By the end of the week, Alice had compiled a small mental inventory: editors, compositors, clerks, governesses, and now her master himself most relied upon the substance in some measure. It was no longer confined to Fleet Street's underground press rooms or the secretive chemists' shops. It had crossed thresholds, entered parlors, and insinuated itself into homes. Yet, as always, London looked the other way. The city continued its relentless pace, applauding its industrious men and women for their brilliance and composure. No law intervened. No moral authority sounded a warning. The household itself continued as if nothing had changed. Alice felt a shiver pass along her spine. She knew she must guard the secret carefully. Speak too freely, and she would be dismissed. Dismissed from the very household whose order she preserved. Speak too little, and the invisible chain of ether would tighten around her master, her colleagues, and the city itself, quietly ensnaring them. That night, as the lamplight flickered against the polished wood of the hall, Alice paused in the shadows, listening to the rhythmic scratching of pen against paper in the study. She inhaled sharply, and the faint chill in the air made her fingers tremble. Ether had entered the home. It had crossed the threshold, and the city's secrets, now shared with housemaids as much as editors, were beginning to unravel. London had taught itself to soothe its nerves, and in doing so, it had begun to erode its very soul. Fleet Street had always been a place of noise, of clatter, of ink-stained chaos. The presses roared, the compositors muttered under their breath, and the editors barked their precise commands across long corridors of type and paper. But in late autumn, a new sort of disruption gripped the thoroughfare, not from machinery, not from human error, but from the subtle unraveling of minds. It began with a single man, Mr. Alcott, a compositor of long standing, admired for his precision and feared for his temper. He had been well enough accustomed to the pressures of Fleet Street's night shifts, the unyielding deadlines, and the ceaseless clatter of type, but over recent weeks he had become erratic. Small tremors in his hands evolved into fits of distraction. Muttered corrections grew incomprehensible. He spoke aloud to himself during the press's pauses, his sentences trailing into incoherence. When Mr. Alcott failed to appear for a morning edition, collapsing instead in the alley behind the press rooms, his superiors knew they could not ignore the situation. Fleet Street, though accustomed to eccentricity, was not prepared for a public unraveling. The inquest had been one thing, a solitary death, quietly recorded, swiftly buried. But a man showing signs of mental collapse among the living demanded attention. The ensuing lunacy hearings were swift, held in a small, smoke-stained courtroom that overlooked the rooftops of Fleet Street. Colleagues, editors, physicians, and a handful of city officials were summoned to testify. The room smelled of ink and wax, of coal smoke and nervous anticipation, and beneath it all lingered a faint, sweet chill, the unmistakable aroma of ether. Witnesses spoke hesitantly, aware that their words might implicate themselves. Harrow, with his accustomed calm, recounted the small blue bottle that had appeared months earlier on his desk. "We began using it to steady trembling hands," he said, voice steady despite the tremor he felt in his chest. "It was meant to preserve our precision, our work, but I fear it has exceeded our control." Physicians presented their findings with careful gravity. Dr. Lewin described the effects of ether on the nervous system: a temporary clarity, a gentle calm, followed inevitably by a rebound of agitation, tremor, and disorientation. They spoke of small doses repeated too often, reaching the threshold where the mind itself became dependent. Fleet Street, the testimony implied, had become a laboratory for human fragility. Alcott himself, brought in under the escort of a constable, was pale and trembling, his eyes bright with the unnatural clarity that ether afforded even as his body betrayed him. When questioned, he admitted to inhaling repeatedly during long shifts, claiming he could not manage the presses without it. "I only sought steadiness," he whispered, voice cracking. "I only wish to serve the paper, to serve London." 1. The panel conferred quietly, aware of the implications. Fleet Street was not merely a street of industry, it was a crucible. Its workers, from the youngest apprentices to the most senior editors, had inhaled a substance that promised control while exacting subtle surrender. By the end of the hearings, the verdict was clear. Mr. Alcott was to be confined to an asylum temporarily, to recover under observation. But the broader issue, the proliferation of ether among the city's pressmen, was left unresolved. Parliament, the courts, and the city's medical authorities all recognized the problem, yet none dared to intervene fully. Fleet Street's brilliance, after all, depended on it. Outside, the presses thundered as usual. Compositors carried on, editors dictated, clerks scurried, and the city beyond ignored the faint, chilling sweetness that drifted upward from the alleyways and basements. Fleet Street had learned, painfully, that genius and obsession could no longer be separated from the chemical that had made both possible. London's heart still beat. But beneath the ink and gaslight, beneath the clatter of presses and whispered confidences, a quiet sickness had taken hold. A sickness Fleet Street would continue to inhale, night after night, until its brilliance became inseparable from its peril. Fleet Street had always walked the edge of propriety. Its presses produced the daily chronicles of London's triumphs, scandals, and disasters. Yet the street itself seemed to exist outside the reach of law, an artery of commerce, pulsing with ink, coal, and ambition. But by late autumn, a different kind of lawlessness had taken root, subtle and insidious, one that statutes could not define and judges could not recognize. The quiet dependence on ether. It began with whispers in the alleyways, faint at first, like the tremor of gas lamps against a wall. Printers and compositors exchanged knowing glances as blue-labeled bottles slipped into pockets tucked beneath jackets, hidden behind ledgers. Young apprentices watched the men they revered inhale a single breath, hands steadying, minds sharpening, and soon they imitated the ritual with trembling eagerness. Discipline and propriety became secondary to the delicate allure of chemical clarity. The authorities, when alerted, found themselves powerless. The coroner could report deaths, physicians could warn of trembling hands and hollow eyes. Parliament could debate the matter at length, its chambers echoing with cautious words and polite concern. Yet no law existed to control a vapor, clear and colorless, sold openly as a medicinal remedy. No statute prohibited its inhalation. No regulation monitored its distribution. Ether remained legally permitted, its dangers unnamed, its consequences invisible to the eyes of law and city alike. Dr. Lewin had attempted to intervene. He wrote to colleagues, detailing cases of tremor, fainting, and long-term dependence. His letters, formal and precise, circulated among the medical community. Some physicians heeded the warnings, most did not. Fleet Street's brilliance, after all, had become entwined with ether. Men would not surrender productivity, precision, or calm, simply because a doctor cautioned them. A notable example occurred one dreary Wednesday morning. Inspector Merrick, called to observe the presses after repeated complaints of fainting compositors, arrived at the alley behind the office with the faint clatter of type echoing beneath the stone walls. He noted the telltale scent of frost and sweetness, watched as men inhaled from small bottles, and sought to intervene. "They are endangering themselves," he muttered to a constable. "I cannot allow this." The constable shrugged. "Legally, you cannot interfere. No crime has been committed." Merrick's jaw tightened. He had hoped to act, to seize the bottles, to warn the masters of the press rooms. But the law could name theft, assault, and homicide. It could not name trembling fingers, hollow eyes, or the quiet surrender of will to a chemical vapor. Fleet Street, in effect, existed in a liminal space beyond statute, beyond oversight, beyond moral reckoning. Meanwhile, the men themselves barely acknowledged the truth. To admit dependence was shameful, even in private. To speak it aloud would risk ridicule, loss of reputation, perhaps even employment. So the inhalations continued, each breath a secret, each exhalation a concession to the quiet tyranny of the vapor. Apprentice and master alike were bound in invisible chains, their brilliance sharpened and their vulnerability increased. By nightfall, the press rooms hummed as usual. Type metal clinked, ink-stained hands moved with precision. Yet beneath it all, an undercurrent of tension threaded through the air, subtle as frost, sweet as sugar. Fleet Street was alive, productive, brilliant, but dependent. And the law, as ever, remained blind. London had discovered a paradox, a remedy so subtle that it became a necessity, a balm that simultaneously healed and enslaved, a chemical that no statute could name, no judge could regulate, and no citizen could openly resist. Fleet Street inhaled it quietly, endlessly, its brilliance inseparable from its peril, its order entwined with chaos. The city slept, unaware, as the presses continued their relentless rhythm, and the addiction the one law could not name spread through its veins like winter fog, silent, inevitable, and utterly unstoppable. By early winter, the pulse of Fleet Street had begun to falter. The presses, once relentless and precise, now churned with an occasional hesitation, a misaligned column, a headline skewed by hands that were too steady for hours and too unsteady in the following moments. The men who operated them, the compositors, the editors, the clerks, had become creatures of subtle duality. Ether, the cold sweetness they inhaled for clarity, had sharpened their minds only to blur them once the breath faded. And in that space between inspiration and dependence, the news itself began to waver. Errors appeared first in small, almost imperceptible ways. A misplaced letter here, a sentence running slightly off the page there. Readers noticed little at first, proofreaders corrected the slips, editors adjusted margins, but each error carried a faint echo of a larger instability. Compositors' fingers trembled beneath the type, their eyes glassy in the gaslight. Even the senior editors, once the city's arbiters of precision, were not immune. A missed correction, a misread proof, a headline that ran into the margin with subtle crookedness became a quiet signature of dependency. One evening, Harrow walked the floor of the press room, eyes scanning columns of type and sheets piled high in neat stacks. He noticed Percival Finch squinting at a page, jaw tight, hands trembling despite the small ether bottle pressed briefly to his lips moments before. "Focus," Harrow muttered, though the word carried more a plea than a command. Finch's response was automatic. His hands steadied, lines fell into place, the copy aligned. But when he lowered his gaze for more than a moment, the tremor returned, subtle and insistent, like the pulse of the city itself. Errors multiplied. The morning edition of the Courier ran a notice of a public lecture a day early, printed a notice of a shipping arrival under the wrong date, and even misattributed a quote from a prominent statesman. These mistakes were minor in isolation, but together they painted a subtle portrait of instability. The precision of the news was no longer entirely human. The editors, already aware of the chemical dependence among their staff, felt the growing dread of inevitability. They could not replace the compositors. They were too skilled, too experienced, too enmeshed in the machinery of the presses. And yet the ether that steadied their hands for hours at a time made them unreliable in its absence. The brilliance it granted came with a hidden cost, a creeping unpredictability that no discipline could contain. Letters arrived from readers noting peculiar errors, minor but unnerving, the wrong date on a market report, a misspelled name of a parish official, a misprinted quotation in a theatrical review. Harrow read them quietly, the cold sweetness still lingering faintly on his breath, and felt the unspoken truth settle over him like frost. The city's information, its carefully constructed reality, had become vulnerable. Fleet Street prided itself on authority, the precision of its words, the reliability of its information. And yet now, the very streets that produced knowledge had become conduits for imperfection, driven by men whose minds were sharpened by ether, only to be dulled by it moments later. No law intervened. No oversight corrected the unseen influence. The city outside continued its relentless pulse, trusting in the printed word even as the press rooms trembled. And within those rooms, beneath the gaslight and ink, Fleet Street learned a dangerous lesson. The brilliance of its news depended not only on intellect and diligence, but on a chemical mercy that had begun to erode both. Ether had promised clarity. Instead, it had made the truth itself unreliable. And London, oblivious, continued to read. The foreman of the London Courier presses had always been a man of authority, a presence that commanded both respect and fear among the compositors. Mr. Gideon Thackeray's voice was low but precise. His instructions met with obedience that bordered on awe. Under his guidance, the presses ran with mechanical efficiency. The type fell in perfect alignment, and errors were corrected before they could mar the morning editions. But in the shadows of Fleet Street, even men of iron discipline could falter. It began quietly. Small signs first, missed cues, a hesitation in his voice, a slip of the pen while tallying sheets. Colleagues noticed, but they attributed it to fatigue, the long hours, the chill of winter. Thackeray himself brushed the tremors aside with an air of quiet denial. He prided himself on stoicism, on mastery over his nerves, on the rigid control that had carried him through decades of deadlines and pressure. Yet the bottles, the blue-labeled vials that had spread through the presses, found their way into his office. Initially, Thackeray resisted, confident that his own discipline was sufficient. But as days lengthened into weeks and the workload grew more relentless, he succumbed. One small inhalation, just enough to steady his hand before examining a freshly cast line of type. Another, later, when the tremor returned despite his best effort. And then the descent began. It was on a bitter evening in November, when frost crept along the stone alleyways and the gas lamps flickered with uneven flame, that the first true signs of collapse appeared. The presses had thundered through the night, the compositors working with a rhythm honed by years, but the final proof sheets had begun to show signs of crookedness, ink smudges, and misaligned headlines. Thackeray retreated to his office, closing the door behind him with a precise click that echoed ominously in the empty hall. Within, he exhaled sharply, reaching instinctively for the familiar bottle. The cold sweetness swept through him, flattening the anxiety and sharpening his focus, but only for a brief, deceptive moment. Minutes later, he sat rigidly at his desk, eyes bright, staring at the type sheets. The tremor returned, subtle at first, then growing with a quiet insistence. He lifted the bottle again, inhaled, and felt the familiar, fragile calm return. And then he laughed, a brittle, hollow sound that filled the locked room, startling even himself. Outside, the presses continued their rhythm, unaware that their master had begun to unravel. Below, the compositors sensed a subtle shift. The air seemed heavier, the gas lamps dimmer. Rumors began to spread quietly among the men who had long relied on Thackeray's authority. The foreman had grown strange, unaccountably restless, and sometimes absent from the floor for minutes at a time, locked behind doors, hands clutching a bottle that no one dared question. By the end of the week, the descent was undeniable. Thackeray's judgments became erratic. His instructions were precise, yet delivered with a tremor in his voice. Mistakes multiplied beneath his oversight, and the men who once looked to him for steadiness began to whisper among themselves, uncertain whom to follow. Yet, no one confronted him. Fleet Street had long since learned to respect appearances. The foreman's authority remained intact in public, his calm exterior masking the turmoil within. Behind closed doors, however, the chain of ether tightened, each inhalation both a remedy and a tether, binding him ever closer to the substance that promised clarity while exacting surrender. Thackeray had always commanded the presses. Now, the presses, relentless, unforgiving, witnessed the quiet erosion of the man who had once held them perfectly in line. And as London slept above the stone streets and fog-drenched alleys, one truth became undeniable. Even the steadiest hand could falter when the breath that steadied it became a master instead of a servant. Fleet Street had long prided itself on resilience. It prided itself on order, on precision, on the ability to turn chaos into daily chronicle. Editors, compositors, and apprentices alike moved through its presses with a sense of purpose, their hands ink-stained but confident, their eyes sharp beneath the gaslight. The rhythm of type, the hum of machinery, the steady clatter of metal and paper, it was all a ballet of control. Yet beneath this polished surface, a quiet tremor had begun, one that the street refused to acknowledge. It began with a subtle tightening of the hand, a minor misalignment of type, a fleeting moment of distraction, small and almost imperceptible. These tremors, multiplied across dozens of men, hinted at a dependence that Fleet Street's pride could not tolerate naming. The blue-labeled bottles, innocuous in appearance, had infiltrated every corner. A compositor here, a junior editor there, even the foreman whose authority had once been absolute. The street itself denied the change. Editors brushed off misprinted headlines as the fault of tired eyes. Compositors excused tremors as the natural result of long hours. Apprentices whispered about unseen bottles only to dismiss the stories as exaggeration. Fleet Street, in its collective pride, preferred to believe that the brilliance of its press was the product of discipline and skill alone. Even in meetings, the denial persisted. When the foreman's hand quivered mid-instruction, it was a momentary lapse, not a symptom of dependence. When the compositors staggered in exhaustion, the cause was overwork, not the subtle grasp of chemical relief. Fleet Street's ethos demanded stoicism, and stoicism demanded ignorance. Harrow, who had long observed the creeping influence of ether, found himself at odds with the city's collective self-deception. He noted the subtle pallor on young Finch's face, the faint sweetness lingering in the corridors, the brittle laughter that punctuated moments of otherwise precise work. He saw the foreman retreat to his office, bottle in hand, eyes bright yet hollow, and yet no one else seemed to see or wished to. Rumors circulated, quietly, in whispers among apprentices and errand boys. "The men are changing," someone said. "They breathe too sharply, their hands move too smoothly, then falter." These words, spoken softly, were not met with inquiry, but with the same denial that had cloaked the street for decades. "It is the hour," one senior compositor replied. "It is the pressure, nothing more." Even the chemists, who sold the bottles discreetly, understood the street's need for illusion. They offered the substance in modest quantities, never questioning the motive of the buyer. They knew that to name the danger aloud would be to challenge Fleet Street's pride, and that was a lesson learned long ago. By nightfall, the presses hummed relentlessly, indifferent to tremor, misalignment, or misjudged spacing. Fleet Street appeared unbroken, efficient, unyielding. The ink on the type gleamed in lamplight. The newspapers, when folded and bundled, seemed perfect. Outsiders, unaware of the quiet surrender within, would never suspect that the brilliance of the street was maintained not only by skill but by dependence. And yet, in quiet moments when a compositor paused, when a foreman's hand shook ever so slightly, when the scent of frost and sweetness drifted from an unseen bottle, the truth pressed softly against the street's pride. Fleet Street was no longer entirely self-sufficient. The city, as always, pretended not to notice. London's press moved forward, relentless, unquestioning. Its brilliance remained untarnished in the eyes of the public. Its dependence, hidden, continued to grow. And so Fleet Street carried on in denial, its pulse steady on the surface, while beneath the ink, the paper, and the lamplight, the grip of ether tightened silently, inevitably, and utterly. The morning began with an unusual quiet. Fleet Street, accustomed to the ceaseless clatter of presses and the hurried footsteps of compositors, seemed to hold its breath. Gas lamps flickered weakly against the fog creeping through the alleys, the glow softened by condensation on the windows, and for the first time in weeks, the familiar roar of metal and ink was absent. The presses had stopped. It was not by accident, nor by maintenance, nor by any mechanical failure that could be traced. The men of Fleet Street simply could not continue. Compositors, editors, and even the foreman were gathered in the press rooms and offices, pale and trembling, hands too unsteady to operate the machinery they had mastered for decades. They carried in them the silent weight of dependency, the unseen residue of the cold, sweet vapor that had become inseparable from their work. Harrow, standing at the head of the room, watched as the men shuffled, some gripping the edges of desks, others leaning weakly against walls. Their eyes darted nervously, as if the absence of the familiar rhythm of the presses had left them untethered. The air, usually filled with the rich scent of ink and heated metal, was now thick with apprehension and the faint, lingering coldness of ether. "It cannot go on," Harrow muttered to himself, glancing at the small blue bottles scattered discreetly on desks, in pockets, beneath ledgers. Some were nearly empty. Others held only a faint glimmer of the liquid, its presence as insidious as the dependence it had inspired. The men had inhaled for clarity, for steadiness, for productivity, but in doing so, they had surrendered more than they realized. Percival Finch approached, hands shaking despite a recent inhalation. "Harrow, I cannot." His voice faltered, a tremor betraying the calm he sought to maintain. "You are not alone," Harrow replied quietly, placing a hand on the boy's shoulder. "We all feel it. The city, the presses, even we ourselves are ensnared." Outside, London stirred. Horse-drawn carriages rattled over cobblestones, newsboys called their wares, pedestrians hurried through the fog. To the unknowing eye, nothing was amiss. Fleet Street appeared from above, as it always did, busy, industrious, relentless. But within the walls of the press rooms, a quiet reckoning had begun. Editors whispered among themselves, voices low and urgent. "We cannot produce today's edition," one admitted. "Our hands, our minds, they falter," another nodded, pale-faced, holding a nearly empty bottle in his hand. "Even with the remedy, it is not enough." The foreman, Gideon Thackeray, stood near the central press, a figure once so commanding that his mere presence had kept the presses moving. Now, he leaned heavily against the iron frame, eyes glassy, hands trembling. He had inhaled more times than he could count, relying on the ether to steady him, to sharpen him, to maintain the perfection expected of him. Yet even that fragile control had failed. For the first time in living memory, Fleet Street was silent. The presses, unyielding and metallic, waited. The men, their brilliance compromised by dependence, could not command them. The city, oblivious to the turmoil within, continued its rhythms above and beyond. And in that suspended moment, Harrow understood the truth. The brilliance of Fleet Street had been borrowed. Its precision had been rented from a cold, sweet vapor. Its steadiness had been purchased at a price no man or street could fully comprehend. The presses would start again, of course. The men would inhale, they would work, they would produce. But the memory of the morning, the silence, the failure, would linger. Fleet Street had glimpsed the edge, had felt the fragility beneath its veneer of discipline. And beneath the ink, beneath the clatter, beneath the gaslight and fog, the grip of ether tightened further, silent, inevitable, and unrelenting. London inhaled once more. and Fleet Street trembled in quiet acknowledgement. The press rooms of Fleet Street were accustomed to scrutiny, audits of production, inspections of type, the occasional visit from a city official. Yet nothing could have prepared them for the inquest that descended upon the compositor's floor in the pale dawn of a winter morning. Word had travelled swiftly. Felix Mallory, a young compositor of exceptional skill, had been found slumped beside the type trays, his hands stiff, his breath shallow, a blue-labelled bottle lying innocently at his side. The coroner arrived first, a gaunt man with eyes like etched steel, followed by a clerk and a shorthand writer. They entered the press room with a solemnity that silenced the usual clatter of the early shift. Compositors, apprentices, and even the foreman gathered around, their faces pale beneath the dim gaslight. For the first time, the machinery's relentless rhythm paused. Ink-stained fingers fidgeted nervously, eyes darting to the bottle and back to the coroner, who began his inspection with meticulous care. Dr. Lewin, called to testify, examined Mallory's body with quiet precision. He described the physical signs of ether inhalation, the slight pallor, the delicate tremor of the fingers, the faintly sweet chill that lingered even after death. "It is a substance of brief clarity," he said, voice low, "one that steadies the hand while demanding an ever-increasing reliance. The mind believes itself in command, yet it is quietly ensnared." His words hung over the room, heavier than the press room air. Witnesses were called. Harrow stepped forward first, his usually steady voice trembling only slightly. He recounted Mallory's early reliance on ether, initially sparing, then increasingly necessary to maintain the precision demanded by the presses. "We believed it to be a tool," Harrow admitted. "We were wrong. It became a master." Other compositors gave testimony, each narrative weaving a picture of gradual surrender. Fingers that had once danced effortlessly across type now shook, not from fatigue alone, but from the withdrawal of the chemical relief upon which they had come to depend. The apprentices, young and impressionable, had observed these rituals in secret and adopted them as imitation. The foreman himself had begun retreating behind closed doors with bottles in hand, his authority maintained only in appearance. Outside the courtroom, London carried on, oblivious. Horse-drawn carriages rattled over frost-covered cobblestones. The fog rolled thick along the alleys. Fleet Street appeared unchanged to the casual observer, productive, industrious, relentless. Yet inside, the truth was stark and undeniable. A young life had been claimed, a mind steadied by chemical artifice had faltered, and a city's reliance on the unseen had been laid bare. The coroner's verdict was delivered with deliberate care. Accidental death due to ether inhalation, prolonged and excessive. It was neither murder nor negligence, yet the implication was unmistakable. A brilliant life, gifted with precision and skill, had succumbed to the very remedy meant to preserve it. The witnesses absorbed the judgment in silence, the weight of inevitability pressing on their shoulders. Harrow lingered near the body, his hands trembling faintly despite the cold clarity he sought in a discreet bottle tucked in his coat. Fleet Street, he realized, had not merely produced another edition, it had cultivated dependence. The presses would roar again, the type would fall perfectly, the news would be printed and read, and London would remain oblivious. Yet beneath the ink, beneath the clatter, beneath the gaslight and fog, a truth had been revealed. Even the steadiest hands, the most disciplined minds, could falter under the quiet tyranny of ether. The inquest had named a victim. The city had yet to name its disease. And Fleet Street, once a paragon of industrious brilliance, inhaled again, trembling, obedient, and utterly dependent. The House of Commons, a cavern of polished oak, gas lamps, and lingering paper-scented air, was ill-prepared for the topic that would rouse its chambers into uneasy murmurs. Ether, a substance invisible yet omnipresent on Fleet Street, had begun to claim its toll, and the city's editors, compositors, and apprentices were quietly unraveling beneath its influence. It was left to Mr. Alverstone, a member of parliament representing a district near the heart of the printing trade, to bring the matter into the full light of debate. He rose steadily, eyes sweeping over the benches lined with men of prominence and influence. "Gentlemen," he began, voice calm yet edged with urgency, "our city's industry, our pride, and our daily news are imperiled by a substance so subtle that it eludes our law, our conscience, increasingly, our control. Ether has infiltrated the presses of Fleet Street, and the consequences are growing undeniable." A ripple of unease passed through the chamber. Many of the MPs, themselves accustomed to long hours of work and study, shifted in their seats, fingers tightening around benches and papers. The discussion was not abstract. It touched on lives, livelihoods, and quietly reputations that might be compromised if the full scope were acknowledged. "Sir," interjected Mr. Linton, a lawyer of notable experience, "are we certain of the evidence? Fleet Street has always been vigorous, and its men accustomed to fatigue. Might this not be exaggerated?" Alverstone's gaze sharpened, cutting across the room. "I speak of documented inquests, of witnesses sworn before the coroner. A young compositor has died, not from accident alone, but through repeated inhalation of ether. Physicians have testified that its effects, brief clarity, temporary steadiness, mask a growing dependency that undermines the very faculties it pretends to preserve." Murmurs spread, quiet and anxious. The city's most disciplined men, editors and compositors who shaped public opinion daily, were now under scrutiny, and the revelation that their brilliance was chemically sustained caused a subtle shudder across the benches. A member representing the Printing Guild rose. "We must not judge harshly," he said carefully. "These men labor under relentless deadlines, producing the daily news that informs London. It is no wonder they seek some aid to maintain their precision." The chamber grew tense. The paradox was evident. The very men who upheld the city's order, who ensured its information flowed without interruption, were dependent on a substance the law could neither prohibit nor regulate. To act decisively would expose not only Fleet Street's reliance, but potentially implicate those who had once spoken in praise of their discipline and diligence. Alverstone pressed on. "Dependence is insidious. It spreads quietly, from compositors to apprentices, from editors to the youngest clerks. Fleet Street's brilliance is borrowed, its steadiness purchased. If we fail to address this, the entire city's understanding of its daily news becomes compromised." A long silence followed, broken only by the scratching of quills on paper and the distant toll of a clock. No resolution was reached. The House adjourned with cautious acknowledgement, yet the matter remained unresolved. Fleet Street continued, as always, to produce its editions, but the debate had cast a shadow over its operations, a shadow the men themselves were too proud, too dependent, and too fearful to confront. Outside, London stirred, unaware. Horse-drawn carriages rattled over frost-slick cobblestones, street vendors hawked newspapers with their usual cheer, and the River Thames reflected the pale light of a sun struggling to pierce the fog. Fleet Street, meanwhile, remained locked in quiet denial, producing its brilliance under the subtle, insidious influence of ether, a brilliance that the law could name but never fully control. And so the city inhaled, once more, its breath sweetened and cold, its news both accurate and unknowingly compromised, its people none the wiser to the quiet tyranny that governed the presses beneath their feet. By the chill of late November, Fleet Street had become a city within a city, a world of ink, type, and shadow, where brilliance and dependence walked hand in hand. But even within these narrow corridors, whispers began to grow louder, and the press, which had once been the city's instrument of clarity, began to turn its lens inward. The first exposés arrived quietly, published in small, reputable journals, their headlines cautious but their implications unmistakable. The secret dependency of London's compositors, a city steady on blue bottles, and ether's grip on the press, an inquiry. The articles were written with care. The language was precise, almost clinical, detailing the rise of ether use among compositors, editors, and apprentices alike. Witnesses, speaking anonymously, described trembling hands that only steadied with a cold, sweet inhalation, young boys adopting the ritual they observed in their elders, and foremen retreating behind locked doors to maintain composure. The journals avoided sensationalism, yet the truth was undeniable. Fleet Street's machinery, its celebrated precision, its brilliance, was entwined with chemical reliance. Readers of these exposés gasped quietly. In households across London, the accounts were discussed in whispers beside tea tables, while the children of the city remained unaware of the quiet infiltration. Clerks in offices paused, glancing nervously at one another. Editors shifted uncomfortably as the words reached their eyes, faces pale beneath gaslight. The city was suddenly aware, though only dimly, of what had been taken for granted for months. Dr. Lewin, whose observations had long gone unheeded, was called upon for commentary. His words were measured, heavy with concern. The dependency is subtle, insidious. It grants precision while eroding autonomy. Men believe themselves in command, yet their faculties are lent by a substance whose demands grow quietly with every use. Fleet Street itself reacted with a mixture of indignation and denial. Editors issued statements in small type, assuring the public that the presses remained unimpeded, that productivity was unaffected, and that rumors of chemical reliance were exaggerated. Compositors, young and old, clutched their bottles a little tighter, inhaling privately before continuing their work. Pride and fear intertwined, creating a fragile veneer over the growing truth. Yet the exposés had power. The public, for the first time, began to question the infallibility of the city's newspapers. Letters arrived at printing offices, polite but pointed, questioning the accuracy of reports, noting misaligned columns, and remarking on inconsistencies that had once been ignored. Londoners sensed that the brilliance of Fleet Street was no longer purely human. It had been lent, borrowed, and repaid in fleeting clarity, leaving tremors in its wake. Some printers read the articles and laughed, masking unease with bravado. Others grew pale, aware that their secret long hidden behind ink and iron had begun to leak into daylight. Apprentices whispered warnings to one another, and the younger compositors, still eager to please, exchanged anxious glances as they measured their own dependence. By the week's end, the press rooms hummed with uneasy energy. The exposés had done more than inform. They had unsettled the delicate balance that Fleet Street maintained. Men inhaled their ether with a new self-consciousness, aware that their stability, once private, once unquestioned, was now a matter of public scrutiny. And outside, London read, unaware of the hands that shaped its news, the inhalations that steadied them, and the subtle tyranny of a substance that had quietly ensnared the city's very pulse. The exposés had rocked London not by scandal, not by fury, but by revealing the quiet fragility beneath its celebrated brilliance. Fleet Street remained productive, its type falling neatly into columns, its headlines folded and bundled. But behind the polished veneer, a tremor persisted, a reminder that the city's steadiness was borrowed, and that the brilliance it had long taken for granted came at a subtle, insidious cost. In the quiet homes along Fleet Street and the adjoining alleys, the repercussions of ether's infiltration extended beyond press rooms and offices, reaching into parlors, kitchens, and bedrooms where families lived and endured. While the men of Fleet Street labored amid ink and type, their dependence followed them home like a shadow, unseen yet heavy, and it touched every corner of domestic life. The Harrington household, once a model of order and decorum, bore witness to these subtle intrusions. Eleanor Harrington had grown accustomed to her husband's long hours, his meticulous attention to deadlines, and the precise nature of his temper, but she had not anticipated the quiet transformation that ether wrought. Thomas Harrington returned from the presses each evening with a steady composure that bordered on brilliance, hands steady, eyes bright, voice calm, but beneath it lay a subtle tremor, a dependence that was invisible yet palpable. At dinner, the family observed the change in manners and rhythm. Thomas placed utensils with precise care, poured wine with meticulous steadiness, and spoke with a sharp clarity that seemed almost unnatural. Yet Eleanor noticed the faint paleness of his lips, the rapidity with which he blinked, the subtle rigidity of his gestures. He was present, yet not entirely himself. The chemical comfort that steadied him had begun to command him. Children, too, felt the shift. The Harrington boys, previously accustomed to playful warmth in their father's attentions, now found a careful formality that was at once unnerving and confusing. Questions that once elicited patient responses were answered with brevity, precision, and a detached clarity that left them unsettled. Even their mother, who prided herself on composure and discretion, felt a quiet anxiety creep into her days, a tension she could neither name nor dispel. Elsewhere, similar stories unfolded. The families of young compositors and apprentices' boys, barely into their teens, watched with silent alarm as their sons emerged from press rooms pale, jittery, and quiet beyond their years. Mothers noticed hands that trembled during simple tasks. Fathers observed eyes that seemed unnaturally alert and unblinking, and siblings remarked on sudden irritability or fatigue. Yet no one could fully articulate the cause. The bottles remained hidden, the blue vials secreted away, the breaths of frost and sweetness inhaled in quiet corners. Even servants, those ever-present observers of household rhythms, sensed the change. A governess whispered anxiously to a chambermaid about the sharp clarity of her employer, about the strange steadiness in the hands of the young apprentices, about the unnatural calm that cloaked the men and women she served. Footsteps grew hesitant, voices lowered in tone, and a hush fell over conversations that once carried freely through kitchens and stairwells. Physicians who visited these homes called to treat faintness, sleeplessness, and anxiety soon recognized a pattern. Though it was difficult to confront, the dependence on ether was subtle, socially invisible, and deeply entwined with respectability. To intervene was to challenge propriety itself, to risk scandal, and to threaten livelihoods. By the end of autumn, London's households were quietly complicit. Families inhaled not only the air thick with coal smoke and fog, but also the invisible, sweet thread of ether that had infiltrated the city's most industrious men and women. Even as the presses roared below, the chemical shadow followed these men home, wrapping its quiet tendrils around the domestic sphere. And so the families of Fleet Street bore the consequences in silence. They observed brilliance and productivity at a cost they could neither name nor resist, feeling the cold, sweet grip of the vapor extend its influence across hearths and bedrooms. London's public face remained untarnished, but behind closed doors, the city's children, wives, and mothers lived under the subtle tyranny of a substance that promised clarity, yet delivered dependency. The pulse of Fleet Street continued to beat, but the homes, once bastions of comfort, now trembled quietly in its shadow. By the chill of December, the quiet epidemic on Fleet Street had begun to attract attention beyond the presses and parlors. Rumors had spread, rumors that could no longer be contained within ink-stained alleyways or behind the closed doors of editorial offices. The city's dependence on ether, a cold, sweet vapor once heralded as a harmless restorative, had begun to surface, and with it came scrutiny of the chemists who supplied it. Mr. Wenslow, whose modest shop on Fetter Lane had long sold tonics, elixirs, and small bottles of ether to physicians and surgeons, found himself at the center of an uncomfortable storm. The inquiries began subtly. A polite note from the guild, a question from a physician concerned with the rising number of trembling apprentices, a cautious visit from a city official whose manners were impeccable, yet whose eyes hinted at suspicion. At first, Wenslow treated the scrutiny with his customary calm. He had always sold substances as directed, never asking questions he need not ask. The small blue bottles were labeled clearly, for professional use, administered sparingly, a remedy for nerves and overwork. He had never imagined that such a simple protocol could unravel into dependence, nor that the very society that relied upon his wares would one day question his discretion. The inquiries grew bolder. Inspectors arrived at dawn, ledgers and labels examined with meticulous care. "Have you tracked your sales?" one asked, voice low but insistent. "Do you record the recipients?" Winslow shook his head. "Only if requested. Most physicians purchase openly. Others are discreet, as is proper." "Discreet," the inspector repeated, almost as though testing the word. "Yet the evidence suggests that apprentices and compositors have obtained bottles without prescription, and deaths have occurred in the city's press rooms. Do you not see a connection?" Wenslow's calm faltered slightly. He explained the protocols, the warnings he gave to every buyer, the labels and instructions provided. He argued that he had acted with all diligence, that the substance was legal, sold to professionals who understood its effects. But the inspectors pressed on, their eyes sharp, their questions unyielding. Across London, other chemists faced similar examinations. Those who had supplied ether to the city's hospitals, offices, and private households were called upon to justify their sales. Ledgers were examined, deliveries traced, and even the faint traces of vapor in the air were noted. The authorities, aware of the inquests, the exposés, and the whispers among apprentices, understood that Fleet Street's brilliance and productivity had been chemically assisted and that the dependency had now reached homes, schools, and hospitals. Despite the scrutiny, Winslow and his colleagues maintained a delicate balance. They continued to sell ether where it was requested, citing its medicinal use, its legality, and its long history in professional practice. Yet each transaction carried a new weight, a subtle hesitation born of awareness. Each bottle, once a simple commodity, now represented both relief and risk, an instrument of calm that could so easily tip into tyranny. Fleet Street watched the proceedings with quiet anxiety. Editors and compositors, aware that their secret was no longer entirely private, measured each inhalation, each exchange, against the growing gaze of authority. Anxiety lingered in the alleyways and offices, a chilling reminder that the city's dependence could not remain hidden forever. And outside, London moved on, oblivious to the inquiries and examinations that sought to unravel a crisis hidden in plain sight. The presses still roared, the gas lamps flickered, and the city inhaled once more, steeped in coal smoke, fog, and the subtle, insidious sweetness of ether. Fleet Street's brilliance remained, but the chemist's quiet compliance and the city's denial ensured that the shadow of dependency would continue to grow. The notion of remedying Fleet Street's quiet affliction had been whispered in the corridors of power and among the press room's senior editors for weeks, yet action remained tentative, cautious, and fragmented. The men who ran the presses understood the danger, they had inhaled it themselves, but the city's dependence on ether was so complete that any attempt to restrain it threatened both productivity and pride. Yet, necessity, or perhaps fear, finally forced a measured response. Fleet Street attempted a cure. The first steps were subtle, almost ceremonial. Editors, foremen, and senior compositors convened behind locked doors, agreeing to reduce exposure to the blue-labeled bottles gradually. They called it a trial of discipline, a measured reduction intended to test whether the men could work unassisted. The atmosphere in the press rooms shifted immediately, hands trembled, even the most experienced compositors faltered, and the rhythm of the presses, once so dependable, grew jagged and uneven. Harrow observed these changes with a mixture of relief and dread. The strategy was necessary, he knew. The longer the men remained dependent, the greater the risk of collapse, of mistakes so severe they could imperil the city's newspapers and the reputation of the street itself. Yet the sight of trembling fingers and faltering compositors, each man gripping type trays as if holding on to life itself, reminded him that this cure carried its own peril. Dr. Lewin was called to oversee the reduction. His approach was cautious, deliberate. Men were instructed to limit inhalations, to rest more frequently, to engage in mental exercises intended to sharpen the mind without chemical aid. Yet the symptoms of withdrawal appeared quickly. Hands shook uncontrollably, hearts pounded, and anxiety threaded through every gesture. A young apprentice fainted mid-shift, only to be revived with hurried care from his peers. Even the foremen, accustomed to commanding authority and maintaining calm, were not immune. Gideon Thackeray retreated to his office, gripping the edge of his desk, eyes wide with the unnatural clarity and unsteady hands that had become his constant companions. Without ether, he realized how fragile his control had become. Without it, the veneer of mastery he projected over the presses was revealed to be thin indeed. The reduction strategy was extended to apprentices and junior clerks. They were instructed in careful breathing, encouraged to rest, and provided with structured guidance to maintain precision without chemical aid. But the subtle coercion of the habit proved formidable. Even the briefest lapse, a missed step, a trembling hand was enough to compel some to return to the bottle, seeking the calm they had come to associate with their work. Outside the offices, London remained unaware. The city, as ever, trusted Fleet Street implicitly. Newspapers were published on schedule, despite the tremors and fainting within. The public had no notion that the brilliance they read was so delicately balanced on a chemical lifeline. By week's end, the cure had achieved only partial success. Some men regained small measures of natural steadiness. Others, unable to resist the urge to inhale, slipped quietly back into dependence. The presses continued to run, the type fell neatly into columns, and the city read on. Yet beneath the surface, a subtle unease lingered. Fleet Street had attempted a cure, but the dependency was too woven into its fabric, too entwined with its rhythm. The brilliance of the presses, the precision of the compositors, the clarity of the editors all remained under the shadow of ether. And in the quiet corners of the press rooms, behind locked doors and beneath gaslight, the men inhaled once more, steady, obedient, and utterly aware of the fragile balance that now defined their world. Fleet Street had tried to heal itself, but the city's pulse, forever entwined with the sweet, cold vapor, remained only partially restored. Mr. Alistair Marwood had been celebrated in literary circles as a man of exceptional wit and precision. His essays, published in the morning papers and widely circulated in pamphlets, carried a clarity and elegance unmatched by his contemporaries. Editors lauded him, colleagues envied him, and readers admired him, often unaware that the brilliance they consumed was not entirely his own. For months, Marwood had relied on the small blue-labeled bottles ether administered, with careful discretion to steady his hands and sharpen his thoughts, particularly during the long nights required to meet Fleet Street's relentless deadlines. Earlier in autumn, Marwood had managed to reduce his reliance, part of the city's tentative attempt to curb dependence across the presses. At first, he embraced the effort with characteristic diligence. He rose early, exercised rigorously, and engaged in careful mental drills designed to maintain precision without chemical aid. For a week, perhaps two, he succeeded. His essays retained their clarity, his hands steadied naturally, and colleagues noticed with subtle admiration the resilience he displayed. Yet the pressures of the press proved insidious. The essayist's schedule remained unforgiving, articles to be completed by dawn, revisions to be checked before morning editions, letters of correspondence from editors, and unsolicited advice from critics. Each demand gnawed at his patience and tested the fragile discipline he had nurtured. It was on a particularly bitter December evening, the fog pressing heavily against the windows of his study, that Marwood relapsed. He had completed a first draft of a critical essay but found the final paragraph resisting him. His thoughts tangled, words eluded him, and a subtle tremor returned to his hand. betraying his inner turmoil. A familiar panic rose, a quiet, urgent insistence that he must not fail, must not falter. The small blue bottle rested innocently on his desk, partially obscured by a pile of completed drafts. Marwood reached for it with trembling fingers, aware of the danger but powerless against the need. The cork eased beneath his grip, the cold, sweet aroma rising to greet him. He inhaled, shallow at first, then deeper, letting the vapor wind through him like a frost-laden wind sweeping through a warm room. The tremor receded, his thoughts sharpened, clarity returned. Words fell into place with unnatural precision. Marwood paused, hands hovering over the type, and realized with a jolt that the relief was immediate but fleeting. He knew with unerring certainty that each breath brought him closer to dependence, each inhalation chaining him tighter to a substance he had once tried to resist. Yet the allure was irresistible. The essay needed completion, the editors expected brilliance, and the city's eyes, though unaware, were upon him. By the following morning, the essay was sent to the presses in perfect form, but Marwood's pallor betrayed him to those who observed closely. His eyes were unusually bright, his lips faintly pale, and his movements carried the slight stiffness of someone whose body had been calibrated by chemical influence. Colleagues exchanged knowing glances. Even a man of exceptional discipline could not resist the subtle tyranny of ether. Across Fleet Street, whispers circulated. Editors noted small tremors in other writers. Apprentices observed the routine in secret, some already imitating the practice. The relapse of a celebrated essayist, a man whose skill had seemed innate, reinforced a truth that the street had been reluctant to admit. No intellect, no discipline, no social standing could withstand the insidious pull of ether indefinitely. And so, amid gaslight and fog, beneath the hum of presses and the weight of expectation, Fleet Street continued to inhale, its brilliance maintained, its dependence reaffirmed. Ether had promised clarity. It had delivered brilliance, and it had demanded its quiet, inexorable repayment. By the close of winter, London began to feel the subtle tremor of its own awakening. Fleet Street, the city's pulsing heart of news and commerce, had inhaled deeply and consistently for months, its men and women bound by dependence upon a substance that promised clarity but exacted surrender. Ether, once merely a tool to steady the hand, had woven itself into the rhythms of work, home, and society. Yet as the first frost softened into January fog, a tentative effort emerged to withdraw, to reclaim the streets, offices, and presses from the chemical grasp that had so silently claimed them. The attempt was neither sudden nor forceful. It began with small measures. Editors instructed compositors to delay inhalations, foremen encouraged rest, and apprentices were guided to maintain focus through deliberate breathing and mental exercises. The withdrawal was gradual, a measured reduction in ether's presence, as though the city itself were attempting to breathe without the frost-laden sweetness that had held it steady for months. Harrow observed the changes with wary eyes. Compositors faltered initially, their fingers trembling as they adjusted to the absence of chemical aid. Lines of type that had once fallen neatly into place now resisted, shifting, misaligning, testing the patience of even the most experienced hands. Apprentices, pale and anxious, exchanged uneasy glances, uncertain whether their own abilities had been natural or borrowed from the substance they had come to imitate. In the editorial offices, the effect was more subtle but no less profound. Editors and writers, accustomed to the unnatural clarity ether had provided, discovered gaps in concentration, moments of hesitation, and a creeping fatigue that seemed amplified by the knowledge of what they were missing. One celebrated essayist, recently returned from a relapse, paused over his manuscript, pencil hovering as his mind attempted to reorient itself without the familiar cold sweetness that had guided his hand. Physicians monitored the change carefully. Dr. Lewin noted the signs of mild withdrawal, tremor, restless agitation, subtle insomnia, and heightened sensitivity to error. Yet he also observed something remarkable, small but undeniable glimmers of autonomy. Hands steadied with practice rather than vapor, focus sharpened through effort rather than chemical intervention. The process was slow, painstaking, and fraught with difficulty, but it revealed a fragile resilience that had been obscured by months of reliance. Even the families of Fleet Street's men felt the shift. Wives and mothers, who had watched hands tremble, eyes widen, and tempers flare with chemical-induced intensity, noted a subtle change in rhythm at home. The clarity that had seemed unnatural now gave way to moments of genuine steadiness, a steadiness earned rather than borrowed. Children, too, observed the subtle transformation, sensing a difference in the cadence of their parents' voices, the gentleness of their gestures, and the gradual restoration of human unpredictability. Yet, the process was neither complete nor painless. Some could not resist, slipping quietly to their bottles, inhaling in secrecy to preserve precision, calm, and productivity. Others endured long nights of anxiety, trembling, and mental unrest, forced to reconcile skill with the absence of chemical reinforcement. Fleet Street's brilliance continued, but it was fractured, uneven, and tentative, its former perfection revealed as the product not solely of talent, but of reliance on a substance now being cautiously withdrawn. And so the city exhaled. London, accustomed to brilliance without cost, now tasted the tension of recalibration. The streets, offices, and press rooms carried an uneasy energy, a blend of relief and apprehension, as the city's pulse adjusted to life without the invisible aid it had long depended upon. Fleet Street had begun the slow withdrawal, each breath deliberate, each step uncertain. Ether had promised clarity. Its withdrawal promised autonomy, slow, fragile, and bittersweet. And the city, trembling yet defiant, began to learn how to breathe on its own. The presses had quieted, the hum of machinery reduced to a faint, expectant vibration, and Fleet Street's men were moving with a cautious deliberation. The slow withdrawal of ether had begun to take its toll. Hands that once moved with unerring precision now hesitated. Minds once sharpened to unnatural clarity now faltered with small uncertainty. And yet, amid the tentative steadiness, one object remained, a small blue-labeled bottle hidden behind the typeset cabinet, the last of its kind. It had belonged, once, to Harrow. He had placed it there weeks earlier, an unconscious act of preservation, a final reserve in case the tremor returned, a safety net in the unpredictable hours of the presses. No one else knew of its presence. Apprentices had long been forbidden access, compositors respected its mystery, and even the foreman had learned to regard it with a mixture of reverence and fear. Yet now, as the withdrawal pressed upon the city's industrious men, the bottle had become both temptation and terror. Every glance toward the cabinet drew a shiver. Every rumble of the presses, a reminder of the dependence it had sustained. Some men spoke of it in hushed whispers. "The last bottle," they muttered, as if naming it aloud might awaken its latent power. Others avoided the subject entirely, pretending that no ether remained, that the blue-labeled vials were gone from Fleet Street forever. Harrow, standing nearby, felt a tension he had not known before. The withdrawal had progressed, tremors were steadier, minds clearer, yet the air seemed charged with a quiet anticipation, as if the last bottle held the culmination of months of dependence. He thought of Mallory, of Alcott, of the apprentices who had inhaled in secret, and he understood that the presence of this single vial represented more than a chemical. It was the city's tether, a reminder of vulnerability, carefully hidden behind the facade of human brilliance. Percival Finch approached the cabinet cautiously, his own hands trembling slightly despite weeks of careful adjustment to life without ether. He peered over the top, eyes widening as he glimpsed the bottle gleaming faintly in the dim gaslight. He could feel the pull, subtle and insistent, the promise of steadiness, clarity, and relief. A single breath, he thought, might restore everything, might quiet the tremor that haunted his hands since dawn. Yet instinct restrained him. He recalled the inquests, the exposés, the faint paleness of faces that had once seemed invincible. He remembered the governesses, the clerks, the foremen, all undone quietly by reliance. The bottle was no longer merely a tool, it was a master. To use it was to surrender again. To resist it required courage tempered by the bitter knowledge of what dependence demanded. Across the press room, other men glanced at the cabinet in fleeting acknowledgement, each recognizing the same truth. The last bottle had become a symbol, a sentinel, a reminder that Fleet Street's brilliance had never been entirely their own. It embodied the tension between necessity and autonomy, between inherited skill and borrowed steadiness. No one touched it. The presses awaited, silent, patient, as the city exhaled slowly, collectively holding its breath. Fleet Street had faced its dependence, wrestled with its desires, and begun to reclaim what was inherently human. Hands guided by judgment, minds sharpened by thought rather than vapor. And yet the bottle remained, tucked behind the typeset cabinet, gleaming faintly in the dim light, a sentinel of the past, a caution for the future. Ether had promised clarity. Its absence offered autonomy, but the last bottle, quiet and cold, reminded Fleet Street that the cost of brilliance was never truly erased. The first frost of the new year lay thick over London, curling around the chimneys and settling on the cobblestones like powdered sugar. Fleet Street, once a corridor of endless clatter, ink, and gaslight, had grown quiet in a manner that was almost solemn. The presses, though still formidable, no longer thrummed with the imperious confidence of men dependent upon blue-labeled bottles. Instead, they moved with a tentative, human rhythm, guided by hands that had begun to relearn steadiness, eyes that had begun to trust thought rather than vapor, and minds that felt the slow reclamation of their own clarity. It had been months since the city began the gradual withdrawal, a delicate and cautious process. Editors instructed compositors to work in measured intervals. Apprentices practiced breathing techniques and mental exercises. Foremen monitored the smallest tremor with keen awareness. Withdrawal had not been easy. Hands shook, pulses raced, nerves ached with the memory of dependence. The young were especially vulnerable. The apprentices and print boys who had learned from their elders now faced the challenge of recalibrating both skill and confidence without chemical aid. Yet despite the difficulty, a new steadiness began to emerge, a fragile, earned autonomy that was unmistakable, if not yet complete. Harrow walked the length of the press room one morning, observing the compositors at their stations. Fingers hovered over type trays, then moved with deliberate precision. Eyes scanned proofs and layouts, pausing, adjusting, correcting, no longer in the heightened, unnatural clarity that ether had supplied, but in a steady, deliberate awareness born of effort and attention. A small smile flickered across his face. The men were learning to breathe again. In offices above, editors carefully reviewed copy, pens poised, hands steady without recourse to chemical assistance. Mistakes persisted, but they were minor, human, correctable. The city's newspapers continued to reach the public punctually, their brilliance no longer borrowed, but reclaimed through diligence and resilience. Letters of complaint and admiration arrived from readers, noting subtle improvements in the precision and tone of reporting, a testament to the slow, painstaking restoration of natural skill. Families felt the change as well. Wives, mothers, and children observed hands that were steadier, voices that carried without the tremor of chemical reliance, and evenings that no longer held the faintly sharp scent of ether. Governesses guided lessons with a renewed patience. Editors returned from the offices with a calmness born not of vapor but of earned composure, and households gradually breathed easier aware that the subtle tyranny that had haunted them was loosening its grip. Even the chemists, those who had long supplied the blue-labeled bottles, noted the change. Orders for ether diminished, cautiously, steadily. The vapor that had once floated invisibly through alleyways and parlors began to retreat, leaving behind only the memory of dependence and the knowledge of the quiet cost it had exacted. Fleet Street, in its newfound autonomy, began to move with a rhythm that was human once more. The presses roared in measured cadence. Compositors' hands were guided by judgment rather than chemical steadiness, and editors' eyes caught errors before they left the page. London, the city that had inhaled so deeply, now exhaled with awareness, subtle pride, and cautious relief. Ether had promised clarity. It had delivered brilliance. Its absence restored autonomy. And as the fog lifted from the streets, and the frost glistened beneath the first weak sunlight of the new year, London learned to breathe again, tentatively, deliberately, and wholly by its own measure. Fleet Street was alive once more, its pulse steady, its brilliance reclaimed, and its city quietly awakened to the cost of what had been borrowed, and the relief of what had been regained.